In this god-forsaken world, it was Sion's misfortune to live an equally miserable life. As the shifting sands began to swallow him whole, a bitter thought crossed his mind. Even the weak usually had some small luxury, yet he possessed absolutely nothing. Now, as the transport bus sank into the earth, he calmly accepted his impending demise for one simple reason: he was just too weak. Everything had changed a century ago, when a terrifying beam of light struck Earth from the depths of space. Far from a blessing, that cosmic light began to ruthlessly devour every trace of life on what was once known as the Blue Planet. Before long, the entire world was transformed into a massive, barren desert, forcing the few human survivors to construct isolated fortresses just to stay alive. Watching the desolate landscape roll past his window, Sion wondered why whatever destroyed the world had bothered to leave wretched bugs like him alive. Suddenly, a massive arm slammed violently into the seat right next to his head. The bus bully smiled down at him maliciously, sarcastically claiming that his hand had slipped before mockingly demanding Sion's name so he could apologize. Remaining completely unfazed, the boy stared right back and coldly gave his name: Sion. The brute found it hilarious that he had only a single name, instantly mocking his lack of family. As the rest of the bus erupted into cruel laughter, Sion remained silent, knowing that everyone trapped in this vehicle shared the exact same fate. Slapping a heavy arm around Sion's shoulders, the bully sneered that since they were in the same boat, they might as well get along, noting that there were no innocents here, only criminals and fugitives. Curious, the brute asked what crime Sion had committed to end up there. Fed up with the relentless mocking, Sion delivered a swift, brutal punch that completely deformed the bully's face, the sheer force of the blow sending the giant flying backward across several rows of seats. Standing up and looking down at the groaning man with a somber, icy gaze, Sion told him he was dead wrong before confessing his sin. He was there for murder. Back in the towering city of Neo-Seoul, Sion had learned the hard way that only the strong were treated as human beings. He had killed a street rat who tried to steal his meager belongings, an act he considered nothing special, just trash eliminating trash. However, before dying, the thief had spat out a terrifying warning. His older brother was a highly influential figure. In that moment, true terror gripped Sion. He had effectively signed his own death warrant by crossing Lee Jiri. For if the strong ruled the city, awakened individuals like Jiryung were practically gods. Offending such a powerhouse made Sion a marked man, forcing him to flee into the wasteland on this very bus, bound for the grueling labor mines. Back in the present, the blonde bully wiped the blood from his face, entirely unfazed. A psychopathic smile spread across his lips as he asked if Sion was finished, preparing to unleash his own terrifying power. Suddenly, a sharp, throbbing pain shot through Sion's head, an instinctive warning that something far worse was about to happen. A brutal impact violently shook the bus, sending passengers flying wildly through the air as pure chaos erupted inside. Crackling his knuckles, the blonde bully revealed that he was sent here for the exact same reason, and that Sion had just crossed the line. Panic surged through Sion. He had fled and awakened in the city only to end up trapped with another one in the middle of the desert. A blazing aura of fire erupted around the bully as he proudly revealed his awakened status, eager to teach the rookie a lethal lesson. But before he could strike, the bus shuddered even more violently as a wave of sheer panic gripped everyone on board. From the outside, the massive transport was being rapidly sucked into the center of a colossal sand whirlpool. A blood-soaked passenger screamed at the driver to control the vehicle, but the driver sat frozen at the wheel as the windshield shattered into 1,000 pieces. Realizing the man was completely unresponsive and merely babbling incoherently, the passenger listened closely. Covered in sweat and tears, the driver spat out his final terrifying warning. This wasn't the road to the mine. With bloodshot eyes staring blankly into the abyss, his words became reality as the massive sinkhole closed over the bus, sealing their fate to be consumed by the unforgiving desert. Inside, desperation filled the air as the passengers were tossed around like fragile toys. Sinking rapidly into the suffocating sand, Sion watched the light fade, reflecting on how his life had always been a repetitive loop of endless misery. He remembered his lonely days scavenging through the garbage of Neo-Seoul. To him, facing a hostile awakened or being swallowed alive by a giant desert worm amounted to the exact same thing. In this rotten world, having the strong strip away everything you owned was simply the natural law. Understanding this better than anyone, Sion watched with eerie, unsettling calm as the sand climbed up his face, thinking to himself that dying here was just the logical conclusion of being weak in a world of apex predators. The situation felt so cliché and predictable that he felt the absurd urge to yawn, though he had often fantasized about becoming strong, enough to avoid such a pathetic end. He knew these thoughts were nothing more than the meaningless delusions of a drowning man. His hand barely protruded from the crushing earth as the merciless desert prepared to bury him forever, his fingers slowly sinking as they lost the final battle against gravity. The whirlpool swallowed the last remnants of the bus, and the absolute silence of the wasteland seemed to claim a total victory. But then everything changed. Sion's eyes snapped wide open, blazing with a brilliant, unprecedented golden light. A roar of pure, unadulterated power tore from his throat as a mysterious energy erupted from his body, clothing his chest against an agonizing, burning sensation that raced through every single cell. A vision flashed in his mind of his own skeleton, illuminated by coursing currents of raw power. It was the sudden awakening of a force that had been dormant within him for a lifetime. As the overwhelming power surged, strange visions of the ancient, forgotten world flickered before his eyes, showing long-buried relics of a time before the catastrophe. He saw the shattered head of the Statue of Liberty, resting like a discarded toy beneath the dunas, and the Eiffel Tower twisted and consumed by the desert. Stark reminders that nothing humanity ever built could withstand the wrath of the cosmos. The great cities of the past were now reduced to hollow skeletons of rusted metal, baking under the scorching sun. Sion's pupils contracted as he bore witness to the sheer vastness of a desert that had swallowed the home of billions, its shifting sands slowly grinding, massive bridges and towering skyscrapers into dust. Tightening his jaw, Sion fiercely refused to become just another forgotten corpse in this global graveyard. From the deep expanse of space, the Earth was no longer a vibrant blue jewel, but a scarred, dusty brown sphere fighting a losing battle against total extinction. Back on the surface, a blinding flash ignited within Sion's eyes, signaling that his newfound power had finally broken through. Driven by pure survival instinct, he unleashed a devastating, explosive attack, whispering the words, "Sandblaster!" The burst of raw energy erupted outward, smashing directly into the colossal, monstrous sandworm that was attempting to digest him, clinging to life with everything he had. Sion made a solemn vow to himself. Today would not be the day he died. Drenched from head to toe in the creature's viscous blue blood, he stood upright amidst the carnage, his face reflecting a terrifying, newfound ferocity. His weakness was gone forever. Standing defiant against the massive silhouette of the dying behemoth, he possessed a clear, powerful heartbeat, every cell vibrating with a volatile energy. Looking at his hands in utter disbelief, he wondered if this was the legendary awakening of an awakened. The giant sandworm let out a final bloodthirsty roar, rising once more to crush the young warrior. But Sion no longer ran. He stood his ground looking minuscule yet completely unafraid before the colossus, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. He shouted a challenge to the beast, daring it to try and finish the job. But before the creature could advance, an imposing figure materialized out of nowhere and shoved Sion brutally out of the way, telling him he was just blocking the path. A massive man with dark brown hair unleashed. A shockwave so violent it sent Sion flying through the air, crashing heavily onto the sand far from the epicenter of the battle. Rolling across the dunes, Sion coughed up a mixture of blood and dirt, completely bewildered by the absurd display of raw power. Wiping the sweat from his forehead, he stared up in awe, realizing just how close he had been to death, and noting the terrifying power gap between them. Blue blood splattered across the desert as a colossal, industrial-sized blade belonging to a man named Han Young-beom slammed heavily into the remains of the beast. Dumbfounded, Sion wondered what kind of monster this man truly was. Han Young-beom stood erect over the carcass with an intimidating calmness, firmly ordering his crew to move out as he slung the massive blade over his shoulder, as if it weighed nothing at all. A cloud of dust kicked up as the squad began their descent down the dune, leaving Sion struggling to process the sheer scale of the military strength before him. As Han Young-beom effortlessly dragged his massive sword through the sand, Sion finally understood what it meant to be a true elite awakened. Out of nowhere, a girl with voluminous blue hair appeared beside him, laughing maniacally as she loudly introduced the giant as their captain. Before Sion could even blink, the girl, Giselle, was already on top of him. Stunned by her superhuman speed, Sion felt a sudden chill as she grabbed his arm, realizing her physical strength far exceeded her slender appearance. While Han Young-beom walked ahead with heavy, serious steps, completely unimpressed by his own victory, Giselle playfully mocked the giant worm, claiming it wasn't even a worthy opponent. As the captain sighed in utter boredom at his subordinates' hyperactive antics, Giselle gave a playful military salute, flashing a mischievous, fang-like smile before effortlessly hoisting Sion into the air as if he were nothing more than a light sack of potatoes. In the chaotic movement that followed, she ended up tumbling with him into the sand. Sion groaned in pain, trying to break free from her bizarre grip, but Giselle only laughed louder, examining his bare arm with intense, childlike curiosity. Wondering aloud what kind of rank and ability he possessed, her blue eyes gleamed with wild anticipation. However, her expression quickly turned to genuine surprise. Shouting over to her captain, she pointed at Sion's bare arm, revealing to everyone that the boy didn't bear a single rank, insignia. He wasn't an officially registered awakened at all. Criticizing his teeth, the humiliation of being handled, like a total nuisance stung Sion worse than any of his physical wounds. Suddenly, a green-haired soldier yelled frantically from a nearby military vehicle, warning them that the sun was setting and that they needed to hurry before the dangerous night took over. Looking at Sion with mock pity, Giselle asked the captain what they should do with him, noting he would surely die if left alone in the barrens. Han Young-beom cast a calculating, gray-eyed stare at Sion, weighing whether the boy was a liability or carried some hidden value. Sion fired back a defiant, exhausted glare, refusing to look like a victim. Finally, the captain ordered them to throw him into the Dodge, assuming the boy was originally heading to the mines anyway. Jubilant, Giselle celebrated the decision as they tossed him into the back. The military vehicle roared to life, kicking up a massive curtain of dust as it sped away from the battlefield. While the green-haired driver continued to yell from the front cabin about the perils of the desert night, Sion lay bound in the back, surrounded by heavy supply crates. Though the ride was surprisingly smooth compared to the rickety bus, Sion focused entirely on his own hand. There, hovering just above his open palm, a small perfect spiral of sand began to spin, responding flawlessly to his unspoken will as the vehicle raced deeper into the unknown wasteland. There was no longer any room for doubt. Sion had definitively awakened a supernatural ability. Sitting in the back of the moving military vehicle, he stared intently at his bound hands, his mind racing with a mix of confusion and sudden realization. He couldn't understand why the blue-haired girl, Giselle, had confidently proclaimed that he possessed no rank insignia. Looking closer at his bare forearm, he finally noticed something unusual. The insignia was indeed there, but its coloration was entirely unique. Instead of the vibrant, glowing hues typical of other awakened, his mark was a deep, muted ochre. It was the exact color of the desert wasteland, blending so flawlessly with his skin tone, and the dust around him that it functioned as a natural camouflage. Sion mentally cataloged what little he knew about the global hierarchy. Generally, the distinct color and brilliance of an insignia revealed the fundamental nature of the user's power. He recalled Giselle's manic laughter and realized that magical-type awakened typically bore bright, eye-catching blue marks. Captain Han Young-beom, on the other hand, was undoubtedly a martial combat type, whose insignia would radiate an intense, blood-red aura designed to intimidate. As Sion watched a small stream of sand dance effortlessly between his fingertips, he realized his situation was entirely unprecedented. He had heard rumors of rare ability types, but direct sand manipulation was something completely unheard of. He felt enveloped by a vast, suffocating power that seemed to stretch out without limitations, even though his camouflaged insignia officially marked him as a rank F, the absolute lowest, most pathetic grade in existence, the raw, potential vibrating. Deep within his soul felt as boundless as the desert itself. A predatory, sinister smile slowly spread across his face. For the first time in his miserable life, Sion felt he possessed a genuine weapon to ensure he would never play the role of the helpless victim again. Pragmatic to a fault, he immediately decided to keep his awakening a total secret, hiding his true strength until he grew powerful enough to ensure no one in this cruel world could ever crush him. Cloaked in the shadows of the military truck, he materialized a perfect sphere of sand above his bound hands, a burning ambition taking root in his heart as he made a silent vow. Not just the desert, but this entire wretched world would eventually become his personal stage. The desolate scenery gradually shifted as the truck entered a region of jagged, towering rock formations that formed a natural fortress around a massive industrial complex. Sion had finally arrived at the notorious monocrystal mines. Despite being tightly bound and heavily guarded, he scanned his grim new surroundings with an entirely renewed sense of curiosity. The profound knowledge that he now held the power to defend himself changed everything. A hot-tempered, red-haired guard violently shoved him forward, barking at him to move his legs and completely ignoring Sion's complaints about the restrictive ropes. The guard rudely snapped at him to shut his mouth before he decided to gag him as well, treating him with absolute disdain. A short distance away, Captain Han Young-beom and Giselle stood by their vehicle, watching the guards march the boy into the dark facility. Giselle stretched lazily, yawning as she dismissed Sion's survival as nothing more than a bizarre stroke of luck, noting that it was a fluke the weakling hadn't been digested by the sandworm. Han Young-beom remained perfectly still, his massive arms crossed over his chest as a thoughtful, unusually heavy silence hung over him. Contradicting his vice captain in a deep, gravelly voice, he muttered that it hadn't been a coincidence at all. His piercing gray eyes narrowed as he analyzed the lingering scene, his intuition screaming that something about the boy didn't align with a simple, defenseless casualty. The captain glanced back toward the colossal crater in the distant dunes, where the blue blood of the sandworm was still baking under the sun, recalling a brief, inexplicable spike of raw pressure he had sensed right before delivering his own strike. As Sion's silhouette finally vanished into the subterranean depths of the mine, Han Young-beom felt a rare pang of regret for not even asking the boy his name, inwardly sensing that their paths would inevitably cross again before the end. Sion marched deep into the neo-mining settlement, a subterranean labyrinth illuminated by harsh, buzzing neon signs and rows of precariously stacked metal buildings. The chaotic outpost felt far more like a sprawling, high-security prison than a place for human habitation. The narrow, dust-choked streets were packed with desperate, dangerous-looking denizens, all drinking and eating whatever scraps they could find in an atmosphere thick with crime and misery. Sion muttered in surprise at how developed the black market economy was within a forced labor mine, but his red-haired escort was in no mood for idle chatter. Turning around with a snarl, the guard made it explicitly clear that he wasn't Sion's babysitter, threatening that if the boy didn't keep his mouth shut, he would happily put a bullet through his skull before handing him over. The guard spat on the ground, calling Sion a useless street rat before walking away, and leaving him to his own devices. Recognizing that the system viewed him as expendable garbage, and realizing his stomach was entirely empty, Sion decided to use his brief window of freedom to scout the settlement and forage for food. He eventually approached a dilapidated market stall where an ancient, withered merchant was methodically grinding spices with an unsettling, hypnotic calmness. Sion tried to break the silence with a polite inquiry, but a strange, heavy tension in the air caused him to freeze, his survival instincts warning him to watch the old man closely. On the rusted metal wall behind the counter hung a faded propaganda poster that read, "May our labor illuminate Neo Soul," depicting a group of absurdly joyful, smiling miners that contrasted sharply with the grim, blood-stained reality of the outpost. The old merchant, a man named Clexy, noticed Sion's intense gaze and asked with heavy irony if he found the government's little drawing inspiring. Resting his wrinkled, heavily scarred hands on the wooden counter, Clexy immediately began speaking in cryptic riddles, casually dropping the bombshell that mana crystals were not the true source of energy, keeping the glittering city of Neo Soul alive. Sion, who had already picked up a skewered piece of roasted meat from the display, looked up with intense curiosity and demanded to know what the old man meant. Clexy slowly raised a bony finger, pointing it directly at Sion's face as a mocking, sinister smile stretched across his lips. He explained that the grand secret of Neo Soul was far simpler and infinitely more cruel than the public realized. The desperate, disposable street rats sent to the mines were the literal fuel keeping the upper world running, and whenever the current batch inevitably burned out, the authorities simply brought in more trash to replace them. Refusing to be intimidated by a merchant's dark philosophy, Sion coldly fired back that at his advanced age, the old man should be preparing for the afterlife, rather than giving depressing lectures to newcomers. Clexy merely laughed in his face, demonstrating an alarming amount of intelligence on recent events by asking Sion how the inside of a giant sandworm compared to the warmth of a mother's womb, mockingly predicting that the boy would become monster fertilizer soon enough. Sion indifferently replied that he had only come to this hellhole to make money, prompting the merchant to decide it was time to show him something truly interesting, gesturing with his thumb toward a dark row of metal shelves in the back of the stall. To Sion's initial disappointment, the shelves held nothing but a massive, chaotic heap of dusty cardboard boxes and rusted, broken relics. He inwardly assumed the old man was finally losing his mind, seeing absolutely nothing of value in a literal pile of garbage. However, Clexy's eyes turned ice cold as he revealed the horrific truth. Behind his personal collection, those boxes contained the meager, leftover belongings of the thousands of miners who had arrived before Sion, serving as a literal roadmap of the boy's own future. The merchant explained that every single newcomer arrived with grand delusions of resistance, desperately clinging to whatever small tokens or pride they possessed. But before long, the suffocating terror of dying. In the pitch-black depths of the Manhwa, veins drove them utterly insane, forcing them to systematically sell off their belongings, their dignity, and eventually their very souls just to buy one more day of miserable survival. In the end, everything they fought for slipped through their fingers, like phantom gold fading into the air, leaving them to be entirely consumed by the mines until they plummeted into an absolute, forgotten void. Clexy finalized his grim sermon by stating that while a true man leaves a legacy when he dies, a piece of trash like Sion would leave nothing behind but more worthless waste on the floor of Neo Soul. Finishing his meal with a bitter expression, Sion slammed the empty wooden skewer down, completely done with the old man's psychological warfare. He sharply asked how much he owed for the meat, expecting a standard fee, but Clexy's grin widened as he demanded an astronomical price of 10 sol. Sion nearly choked on the air in pure shock, furiously protesting that 10 sol for a single piece of street meat was an outright scam, as if the food had been dusted with pure gold. Clexy mockingly reminded him that in a subterranean desert hellhole, every single bite of real food was a priceless luxury, and that the meat he had just swallowed accounted for the entire price. Just as Sion prepared to aggressively refuse the extortion, the atmosphere inside the stall shifted violently. From the deep shadows of the market alley, several heavily armed thugs materialized, brandishing rusted meat cleavers, heavy axes, and combat knives, instantly cutting off all avenues of escape. Despite being completely surrounded by killers, Sion kept his posture perfectly steady, maintaining a fierce glare as he reiterated that he wouldn't hand over a single cent to a thief. Suddenly, a massive, suffocating shadow fell over his back as an incredibly large, muscular enforcer crept up silently behind him. The sheer physical pressure, indicating that the situation had escalated far beyond a simple street scam. Clexi crossed his arms, thoroughly enjoying the terror of the trap he had sprung, and asked Sion with pure malice what his next move would be. A heavy, resounding slam vibrated through the counter as the giant enforcer placed a massive hand onto Sion's shoulder, pinning him in place. Sion attempted to de-escalate the situation logically, telling the merchant to be reasonable since it was physically impossible for a newly arrived prisoner to carry that kind of currency on his person. But the giant's grip only tightened effortlessly, forcing Sion to feign compliance, desperately asking that they talk this over calmly. Clexi chuckled warmly, falsely claiming he was a deeply reasonable businessman, before pointing a crooked finger directly at Sion's coat pocket. He revealed his true objective, the valuable, high-grade Romana crystal Sion had managed to smuggle in would serve as a perfect settlement for the food debt. Sion froze in utter disbelief, horrified by how rapidly rumors of his hidden treasure had spread through the lawless outpost. As the old merchant mockingly demanded the stone, promising a fair trade, a white-hot rage began to boil deep within Sion's veins. He remembered the excruciating pain, the terrifying risks, and the near-fatal struggle he had endured. Just to protect that single crystal from the vultures of Neo-Soul, he attempted one final negotiation, asking if he could simply start a credit account. But the enforcer's hand compressed his shoulder with bone-crushing force. The volatile tension in the room finally snapped. His face contorted in psychotic rage. The giant enforcer roared at his boss for permission to bury the arrogant brat into the dirt, once and for all. In that split second, Sion made a definitive choice. He reached deep into his soul, channeling his hidden golden energy as the destructive force of his sand blaster, prepared to tear the entire market stall apart. In a terrifying flash of imagination, Sion envisioned the immediate future. The brutal impact of his sand energy severing the giant's arm, a massive explosion of golden dust vaporizing the surrounding thugs, and himself standing amidst the absolute carnage with glowing, demonic eyes and a dark aura that proved he was no longer an elite's prey. But the violent fantasy abruptly shattered, dragging him violently back to reality. The massive enforcer was still very much alive, violently shaking his shoulder and screaming directly into his face to look him in the eyes, breathing heavily and breaking out into a cold sweat. Sion realized the lethal display had only been a vivid daydream brought on by his awakening. A cold, pragmatic calculation washed over him. He possessed the raw power, but his body was far too exhausted and his mastery over his sand manipulation was too unrefined to survive a full-scale war against an entire network of armed syndicates. Right now, letting out a heavy defeated sigh, he reached into his pocket, pulled out the glowing blue mana crystal, and slammed it violently onto the wooden counter, telling Clexi to take the stone and choke on it. Sion salvaged whatever remaining dignity he had left under the mocking stares of the thugs. The old merchant snatched the crystal with pure, unadulterated avarice, genuinely shocked that a pathetic newcomer possessed a stone of such immense size and pristine clarity. Clexi oily remarked that with a great deal of luck, he could value the stone at roughly 100 sol. Sion exploded in pure indignation, shouting that the crystal was easily worth 3 times that amount on the open market. The merchant merely laughed in his face, cruelly reminding him that supply and demand worked differently in hell, and that if he didn't like the transaction, he was always free to go back outside and become food for the sandworms. Frustrated to the point of madness and possessing absolutely no legal recourse, Sion violently slammed his own forehead down onto the wooden counter in a gesture of pure, suppressed rage against the profound injustice of the world. His fingernails dug deep into the wood as he forced himself to breathe, repeating a silent mantra over and over in his mind. Not yet. It is not the time to strike. When he finally raised his head, a thin line of blood was trickling down his forehead, but his face was set in an unsettling, chilling smile. He coldly demanded that if the old thief was going to rob him, he had better provide a substantial bonus from his scrap pile to close the deal. The giant enforcer didn't flinch, darkly warning the boy to watch his tongue because the settlement was crawling with dangerous thieves. Sion fired back a venomous glare, deadpanning that he was currently looking at the biggest thief in the zone. Intrigued by the boy's unbreakable spirit, Clexi decided to show a rare sliver of generosity for their inaugural business transaction, announcing that in addition to the 100 sol, Sion could select any single item from his personal graveyard of junk in the back. Sion turned his back on the thugs, indifferently scanning the chaotic mountain of worthless debris, old cardboard boxes, grease-stained rags, and broken mechanical parts. He began to rummage through the pile without any real enthusiasm, fully aware that everything here consisted of the discarded remnants of dead men who had failed to survive the mines. Behind the counter, the old merchant watched him in absolute silence, inwardly reassessing the boy and realizing he possessed a bizarre, resilient vitality completely absent in the hollowed-out eyes of the other laborers. To Clexy's utter bewilderment, Sion suddenly pulled out a ridiculous, novelty disguise consisting of fake plastic glasses, a plastic nose, and a bushy mustache, placing it over his blood-stained face with an expression of deadpan seriousness. While Clexy muttered that it was rare to see a condemned man with such an absurd sense of humor, Sion's playful demeanor instantly vanished. His gaze locked onto a specific, heavily weathered object buried beneath a pile of rusted iron. He stopped moving entirely, staring at the ancient relic with profound instinctual curiosity. Noticing the shift, the merchant explained that the strange item was an antique left behind by a forgotten desert caravan an eternity ago. Keeping the ridiculous plastic glasses firmly on his face, Sion carefully lifted the object into the light. It was an incredibly ornate, heavy, and deeply mysterious ancient hourglass, its interior filled with a strange, shimmering dust. Sensing an inexplicable magnetic pull from the relic, Sion looked the merchant dead in the eye and declared that he had found his bonus. Convinced the boy had no eye for actual value, Clexy gave him a patronizing slap on the back as he walked out, mockingly bidding farewell to the strange rookie, who possessed a truly magnificent talent for collecting worthless garbage from the floor of Neosol. Sion turned on his heel and began walking away from the market, his few new belongings clutched tightly in his arms. But before disappearing entirely, he paused and called out over his shoulder to ask the old merchant his name. "The name's Clexy," the old man shouted back, his raspy voice cracking with absolute amusement as Sion resumed his march toward the laborer barracks without looking back. Sion spat a bitter response into the dirt, muttering that he hoped he would never have to look at the merchant's wrinkled, wretched face again for the rest of his natural life. Watching the boy's silhouette bleed into the dense obscurity of the mining outpost, Clexy simply chuckled to himself, quietly whispering into the shadows that the arrogant little rat would be seeing his face much sooner than he anticipated. Later that evening, the ancient hourglass sat quietly on the cold, uneven floor of a cramped and decrepit room, its mysterious sand flowing downward in a slow, hypnotic rhythm to mark the agonizing passage of time. Sion lay flat on his back on a stained mattress, his eyes locked entirely onto the relic, as he calculated that he had roughly 10 minutes left before the shimmering grains completely ran out. The room itself was an austere, filthy concrete box assigned to the lowest-tier miners, smelling of stale sweat and subterranean mold. Sitting cross-legged on the hard floor, Sion closed his eyes and attempted to concentrate deeply, inhaling and exhaling heavy, ragged breaths as he tried to purge the massive physical and mental trauma he had accumulated during his first day in this living hell. When he opened his eyes, his pupils burned with an intense amber brilliance. Gripping the antique hourglass firmly with both hands, he unleashed a sharp, authoritative command to the object, "Move." The pristine glass merely reflected his own desperate, determined face. The mysterious dust within remained entirely indifferent to his willpower, continuing its slow descent without a single trace of supernatural energy. A wave of profound frustration washed over Sion as he realized the hourglass wasn't doing anything special at all, causing him to bitterly conclude that his sand manipulation awakening had absolutely nothing to do with this piece of junk. He stared blankly into the empty air of his room, completely certain that he had never encountered this specific object before in his entire life, yet looking at it resting amidst the clutter of his small room, next to a faded childhood plush toy and a cracked digital clock. An unbearable, suffocating sense of déjà vu gripped his chest. It felt as though someone had deliberately placed this exact hourglass here, specifically for him to find, calling out to him through an inexplicable magnetic connection that felt simultaneously brand new and ancient. Bam! Without a single second of warning, the fragile metal door of his room flew completely off its hinges with a deafening metallic screech, splintering under the weight of a violent, savage kick. A massive, towering enforcer stormed into the small space, his face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage as he screamed like an absolute psychopath. It was the notorious mine supervisor, a ruthless brute named Manhwa, and he was out for blood. The giant roared at Sion, demanding to know why his worthless ass hadn't reported to the mining queues yet, snapping that he had physically been forced to waste his own time tracking the boy down. Refusing to let his spirit be crushed so easily by sheer physical size, Sion pushed himself off the floor and locked eyes with the giant coldly, stating that his name wasn't Bastard, and throwing it back in the supervisor's face that absolutely no one had given him directions to the lower sectors. The insolent response instantly enraged the giant. With a speed that defied his massive bulk, Manhwa unleashed a brutal, sweeping strike that sent Sion crashing violently across the room. the sheer physics of the impact demonstrating the staggering, insurmountable gap in their raw physical strength. Tightening a fist that looked capable of shattering solid rock, the supervisor made it clear he was entirely done tolerating the rookie's arrogance. With a sickening thud, Baek Min-ho pinned Sion to the concrete floor, unleashing a devastating, one-sided beating while screaming at him to shut his godforsaken mouth if he had any desire to keep breathing. Sion could barely draw oxygen beneath the relentless torrent of heavy fists, his eyes wide with blinding pain. But beneath the agony, a dark, venomous rage began to ignite deep within his soul. Finally, Baek Min-ho relented, grabbing Sion by his collar and tossing him aside like a piece of dirty laundry, callously ordering him to stand up and follow immediately, if he didn't want the punishment to become permanent. Trembling uncontrollably from the sheer agony of his bruised ribs and internal injuries, Sion dragged himself off the floor, staring at the broad back of the retreating supervisor with an absolute, sacred vow echoing in his mind. Sooner or later, no matter what dark sins he had to commit, he would murder this man with his own hands. A short while later, they arrived at the terrifying threshold of Sector 3's primary mining shaft, a dark, dismal abyss enveloped by a maze of rusted transport carts, iron rails, and billowing clouds of toxic industrial steam. They were met by a weathered veteran miner clad in scarred reflective gear, still radiating pure malice. Baek Min-ho barked, a harsh order at the old-timer to hand over the work equipment to the useless bastard immediately. The veteran quietly complied, helping Sion pull a bright orange reflective vest over his bruised torso before grimly warning him that the cost of every single piece of gear would be systematically deducted from his meager salary, and that absolutely every grain of mana crystal he uncovered in the deep veins belonged strictly to the company. Strapping on a heavy protective helmet equipped with a dirty headlamp, Sion felt the crushing weight of his new reality, trying to calculate what his daily wage would be, while attempting to navigate the terrifying precarity of his situation. Crack. A heavy, iron-headed pickaxe was slammed violently into the rocky ground mere inches from Sion's skull, the vibrating shockwave causing him to jump backward in utter shock. Baek Min-ho stood over him, his veins bulging as he furiously roared that the pickaxe was coming out of his paycheck too, mockingly asking if he also needed a personal tutorial on how to use a basic tool. Pointing a thick finger toward the darkest, most unstable region of the complex, the supervisor delivered a cruel, lethal sentence. Throw this idiot into shaft 972. The veteran miner turned deathly pale, his voice trembling as he desperately tried to reason with the supervisor, explaining that the lower quadrants of 972 were still highly unstable and plagued by lethal anomalies. Baek Min-ho didn't tolerate a single word of dissent. Leaning in close, he threatened to throw the veteran down the shaft in Sion's place if he didn't obey the directive. Immediately, left with absolutely no choice, the terrified old miner nodded submissively. As they began dragging Sion toward the iron gates, Baek Min-ho screamed his final warning down the corridor, vowing that if Sion dared to return to the surface without a high-grade mana stone, he would personally rip his throat out. Sion spat a lethal insult between his teeth, thoroughly done with the giant's constant threats, as he and the veteran descended into the suffocating depths of the mountain, navigating a labyrinth of pitch-black, dust-choked tunnels that seemed to spiral endlessly into the crust of the earth. The profound corruption of the Neo soul mining operations became visible, almost immediately. As they walked, the veteran quietly explained that the lower depths housed an entire illegal underworld, designed to keep the prisoners compliant. Clandestine gambling dens, bootleg alcohol, and highly addictive street narcotics ran rampant, serving as a mirror image of the slums back in the upper city. They stepped into an ancient, rusted elevator cage that shrieked and groaned ominously with every foot of descent. Clinging to his pickaxe with absolute reluctance, Sion listened as the old miner revealed that his horrific treatment today was simply a matter of terrible luck. Baek Min-ho had reportedly lost his entire life, savings gambling on the upper tiers the previous night, and was merely using Sion as a punching bag to vent his personal financial frustrations. Sion bitterly complained about the unfairness, noting that his skin was as sensitive as a newborn's, and that manual labor would tear his hands to pieces, showing absolutely zero enthusiasm for the grueling physical torment ahead. The elevator cage finally groaned to a violent halt at a subterranean level completely starved of light. The veteran stepped forward, his face obscured by the shadows as he remarked in a chilling, somber tone that Sion wouldn't have to worry about superficial hand blisters for very long. Emerging from the elevator, they were confronted by a jagged cavern maw entirely swallowed by a thick, unnatural fog of deep obsidian mist. So this is the infamous Shaft 972, Sion murmured, his survival instinct screaming at the eerie, malevolent atmosphere radiating from the dark tunnel. Attempting to maintain some semblance of hope, he naively asked if he could just chip away a few crystals and ride the elevator back up once his quota was met. The veteran's response turned the blood in Sion's veins to absolute ice. "You're never coming back," the old man explained with a hollow voice that over a dozen laborers had mysteriously vanished without a trace inside that specific fog within the last 2 weeks alone. He personally knew 4 veteran diggers who walked into that darkness and never returned, their fates entirely unknown to the administration. Before Sion could even process the horror, the iron elevator cage slammed shut and began ascending rapidly, leaving him completely isolated in the crushing, absolute darkness. The veteran miner looked down through the iron grates, with a mixture of profound pity and helpless resignation, calling out a final, haunting apology. "I'm sorry, kid, and thank you." The old man thanked him for willingly taking the fall, entering a death trap that no other miner would ever step into under normal circumstances. Pure, unadulterated panic seized Sion's chest as the terrifying reality set in. He had been left to rot in a legendary slaughterhouse. He screamed desperately into the shaft, begging the man not to leave him abandoned in the dark, watching in absolute horror as the faint, flickering light of the elevator vanished into the high ceiling, leaving him utterly submerged in the oppressive, suffocating silence of Shaft 972 with absolutely no exit in sight. Left entirely alone in the suffocating blackness, the terrifying fear rapidly twisted back into a blinding, white-hot rage. Sion cursed Manhwa and the entire corrupt administration, his mind fracturing at the sheer injustice of being sent to die over a supervisor's petty gambling debts. In an uncontrollable fit of blind fury, he hoisted his pickaxe and slammed it violently against the cavern wall. But the solid rock was far harder than ordinary stone. The iron head recoiled violently against the surface, sending a painful shockwave through Sion's hands that caused the tool to slip dangerously from his grip. The pickaxe went flying into the deep, pitch-black abyss of the tunnel, clattering against the stones before vanishing entirely from his line of sight. Sion lunged forward in a desperate, vain attempt to catch it, but his hands closed on empty air, leaving him completely disarmed, defenseless, and vulnerable to whatever horrors lurked within the fog. Forcing himself to freeze and steady his breathing, he carefully examined the bizarre structural anomalies of the cave surrounding him, instantly realizing that this was no ordinary mining vein. "What kind of fucked up place is this?" he whispered, deeply intrigued and unsettled by the heavy atmosphere. The air wasn't thick with standard coal or stone dust. The dense, shimmering mist swirling around his boots was composed of raw, unrefined mana. The magical energy in this forgotten, subterranean corridor was so concentrated it was practically fluid. Slipping his heavy helmet off to get a clearer look, Sion knew well that any ordinary human being would suffer a fatal mana overload within a matter of seconds under these conditions, leaving him to wonder in absolute amazement where on earth such a colossal, concentrated source of cosmic power could possibly be bleeding from. Desperate to recover his only weapon, Sion crawled forward through the pitch-black tunnel, carefully feeling along the jagged, icy rock floor until his headlamp caught a faint, metallic glint in the distance. Relief washed over him as his fingers closed around the pickaxe, but his expression instantly darkened when he lifted it. The thick wooden shaft had been snapped cleanly in two by the sheer force of the previous impact. The neck is totally broken, but at least I found the damn thing," he muttered dryly to himself, attempting to force a shred of optimism in the face of his catastrophic streak of bad luck. For a fleeting second, he believed he might still have a sliver of fortune on his side, but the universe immediately proved him wrong. Without a single sound of warning, the solid stone beneath his boots disintegrated entirely, and a massive, roaring whirlpool of deep crimson energy erupted beneath his feet. His eyes snapped wide open, reflecting absolute, unmitigated terror as the forces of an unnatural gravity violently sucked him downward into a blazing, unknown void. Sion plummeted into the bottomless abyss, screaming at the top of his lungs as his mind raced to comprehend what kind of dimensional portal or localized, magical anomaly was dragging him into the bowels of the earth. His safety helmet and the shards of his broken pickaxe fell alongside him into the vacuum, spinning entirely out of control, while the beam of his headlamp cut erratically through the shifting penumbra, briefly illuminating the shattered tool one last time, before both were swallowed whole by the vastness of the subterranean void. As he fell through the endless darkness, the terrifying sensation of weightlessness caused his mind to fracture, filling his consciousness with a torrent of bitter, deeply painful childhood memories. In his mind's eye, he saw himself as a discarded, skeletal child abandoned in a torrential downpour, while the passing adults callously muttered that a street rat, like him, would undoubtedly freeze to death before the week was out. Back then, what kind of life had he actually desired? A memory flashed of a younger Sion stealing a meager scrap of meat from a market, stalled just to survive the winter, receiving a brutal, bone-breaking beating from the merchant guild in exchange. Back then, his entire existential dream was simply to exist in a world where he never had to feel the agonizing gnawing of hunger again. He saw another vision of himself sprinting frantically through the pitch-black, rain-slicked alleys of Neo-Seoul, pursued by a violent, bloodthirsty mob. He had only wanted the simple luxury of dreaming about a future, just like any normal child. Your pathetic worm-like life ends here." His hunters had roared as he fled in absolute terror. His heart had yearned only for an existence where he wasn't constantly running a losing race against an early grave. The echoing voices of his past captors resonated through his subconscious, barking orders to bring his head to Lei Rayong no matter the cost. While Sion had desired nothing more than a normal life without the permanent, suffocating shadow of death hanging over his shoulders. A normal life, a concept so simple yet for him, it had always remained an entirely unattainable fairy tale delusion. The lingering memory of that relentless persecution ignited a fierce, burning hatred within his chest, shattering the illusion just as the final impact arrived. Sion violently regained consciousness, gasping for air as he found himself lying face down on a cracked, searing rock floor surrounded by a thick, oppressive vapor that actively scorched the lining of his lungs. He dragged his battered body upward with immense difficulty, clutching his throbbing head, as he desperately tried to orient himself in the new environment. The atmosphere was completely suffocating, radiating a humid, blistering heat that was almost entirely insupportable. As his fingers brushed against the rocky terrain, they came away coated in a fine, powdery ash-gray residue. With a jolt of pure horror, he realized that the ground beneath him wasn't composed of earth or stone. It was literal volcanic ash. Wiping the heavy sweat from his bruised, blood-stained face, he raised his eyes, his gaze widening in sheer disbelief and primal fear as the terrifying landscape finally revealed itself through the smog. The absolute, undeniable reality struck him like a physical blow. If he had fallen through a localized spatial portal from the depths of a mana mine, this environment could only mean one catastrophic thing. Stretching out before his eyes was a hellish, primordial underworld of churning lava lakes, rivers of molten rock, and massive, roaring columns of absolute fire. Sion had been dropped directly into the treacherous heart of an active volcanic dungeon. Waking up amidst the absolute disaster of the volcanic terrain, entirely choked by ash and sulfurous smoke, Sion glanced down at his hands and realized with a shock that his skin was actively throwing off bright orange sparks. The ambient temperature was so extreme, his body was literally beginning to cook alive on the rocks. The agonizing heat forced a sharp scream from his throat, and driven by pure survival instinct, he began running like a madman away from the open magma vents. Pausing behind a massive basalt crag to catch his breath, he forced his racing mind to accept that this wasn't a hallucination or a fever dream. This was the grim, unyielding reality of being trapped in an active dungeon. Noting that his palms were heavily stained with black volcanic sediment, he recognized that if he didn't find a way out of this sulfurous chamber immediately, the toxic gases would permanently dissolve his lungs. Reaching down, he aggressively tightened the straps of his heavy combat boots, knowing with absolute certainty that the path ahead would be a brutal, merciless gauntlet where a single misstep meant being vaporized. Tearing a strip of fabric from his shirt, he tied the makeshift rag tightly over his nose and mouth to filter the ash-choked air, his eyes hardening with a cold, predatory focus as he began to map out his definitive route of escape. Looking up through the billowing clouds of sulfur, Sion locked his eyes onto a colossal, jagged mountain drenched in cascading rivers of glowing magma. It was blindingly obvious that this towering peak was the highest point in the entire cavern and his absolute only shot at survival. Noticing that there were temporarily no monstrous entities within his immediate line of sight, he took a deep, agonizing breath to steady his racing pulse and prepared to launch himself into a desperate, high-stakes sprint. He lunged forward with every single ounce of physical strength, remaining in his battered frame, kicking up dense plumes of fine volcanic dust with every explosive stride. To drown out the suffocating terror clawing at his chest, he fiercely roared into the void to motivate himself, vowing at the top of his lungs that he was Sion and he would never throw in the towel so pathetically. He executed a powerful, desperate leap over a crumbling fissure of blistering earth, his boots skidding dangerously across the volatile terrain. Without warning, the fragile crust gave way completely beneath his weight, nearly plunging him straight down into a bottomless chasm of fire. Clawing frantically at the air in a sudden surge of panic, his fingers scraped against a jagged ledge, searching blindly for any solid grip to halt his fatal descent. In a dazzling display of pure survival instinct, he launched his body into a desperate acrobatic leap, twisting through the air to dodge violent geysers of molten rock that erupted from the ground like lethal fountains. Making a borderline superhuman physical effort, he managed to latch his fingers onto an intensely hot rock shelf, dragging his bruised torso upward onto a temporary platform of safety. Collapsing heavily onto the blistering ground on the opposite side of the chasm, Seon rolled onto, his back desperately gasping for oxygen that his scorched lungs could no longer properly extract from the toxic air. He slammed his fist hard against the burning earth, grinding his teeth to swallow the excruciating pain radiating from his fresh wounds. Consumed by a white-hot rage, he began to curse back Manhwa at the top of his lungs, swearing an absolute blood oath that he would personally murder the supervisor the exact second he clawed his way out of this hellish labyrinth. However, he abruptly cut his own tirade short, realizing with grim pragmatism that letting his temper flare was only raising his core, body temperature, and wasting invaluable physical energy. Shaking off the psychological weight, he swore on his very life that he would escape this subterranean furnace one way or another, regardless of the toll it exacted from his body. Looking ahead, he rapidly calculated the distance across the burning expanse, estimating that he was only a few precise leaps away from clearing the primary danger zone. Staring down into the churning abyss of liquid fire blocking his path, he mentally steeled himself for the final gauntlet. Covering his face with a makeshift rag, he commanded himself to stop overthinking and just move. He broke into a determined trot, a cold, unyielding fire igniting within his eyes as he launched his body into the open air once more, placing his entire existence in the hands of his primal survival instincts. Just as Sion reached the apex of his leap, suspended helplessly in midair, a catastrophic maw of unimaginable proportions tore open directly beneath him, ready to swallow him whole in a single bite. A colossal, primordial behemoth forged entirely from jagged black rock and pulsing veins of pure magma erupted from the burning depths, completely obliterating his path forward. The massive entity slammed violently against the canyon wall, unleashing a catastrophic avalanche of boulders and liquid fire that rained down across the cavern. Searing fragments of rock flew in every conceivable direction as the monstrous creature unleashed a deafening, cavern-shaking roar. The beast's massive head slowly emerged from the billowing flames, its ferocious, glowing eyes locking onto Sion with lethal intent, while rivers of glowing magma dripped from its stone fangs, making it explicitly clear that it was preparing for a definitive crushing strike. Driven by pure reflex, Sion thrust his arm forward and began desperately manipulating the thick volcanic ash, swirling through the air to cushion the impending kinetic shockwave. As the supernatural power coursed fluidly down his arm, he internally confirmed that his awakening was real. He truly possessed the absolute authority to command this burning environment to his will. He landed with a bone-jarring thud on a narrow rock outcrop, having narrowly evaded the creature's initial strike, and collapsed onto his stomach. Realizing with sudden dread that the suffocating environment of this volcanic dungeon was infinitely more lethal than any physical monster. His nasal passages burned fiercely from the intense heat, and his chest heaved violently as his body began to reject the oxygenless air. Lying there in the oppressive penumbra, a terrifying thought crept into his mind, leaving him to wonder if this forgotten, hellish trench would become his final resting place. Gasping for breath, Sion attempted to drag himself up once more, bracing his trembling ash-stained hands against the blistering stone floor. He bitterly spat out a complaint to the empty cavern, muttering about how profoundly unfair it was to die in a hole before he had ever even had the chance to get a girlfriend. Stamping a foot firmly onto the rock, he fiercely refused to let his legs fail him at such a critical juncture, steeled to fight whatever horror came his way, and openly declaring to death itself that today would not be his day. Suddenly, deep within the pulsing sea of lava, a truly massive, burning eye materialized from the volcanic depths, radiating an unbearable aura of power. Sion shielded his face as best he could, a visceral cry of terror escaping his throat at the sheer weight of the presence looming over him. Yet, out of nowhere, a mocking, deeply amused voice echoed effortlessly through the roaring flames, casually commenting that the boy possessed a rather intriguing ability. The unseen intruder continued to mock Sion's unique authority over the sand and ash, leaving the terrified boy to desperately scan the fiery void, wondering who on earth could possibly be speaking in the heart of a lethal dungeon, high above the roaring lava. Monster, a human silhouette, suddenly descended from the cavern ceiling at a terrifying velocity. It was an old man bearing a feral, predatory grin, looking as though he were thoroughly savoring the absolute chaos unfolding around him. Sion watched in utter disbelief as the old man dropped from the high firmament as if strolling through a park, landing with a cataclysmic impact that kicked up a violent shockwave of shattered boulders and blinding dust. The stranger's long silver mane and piercing red eyes gleamed with a terrifying intensity capable of breaking the resolve of the bravest warriors. Shielding his eyes from the flying debris, Sion realized that something of a catastrophic scale was about to unfold. A brilliant, blinding pillar of pure white light cut through the center of the cavern, with an apocalyptic, destructive force that shook the foundational pillars of the entire dungeon. The resulting kinetic shockwave was so immense it began to physically systematically disintegrate the thick stone floor surrounding the point of impact, transforming the entire chamber into a churning vortex of blinding sand, searing debris, and absolute heat that dragged anything in its path into oblivion, thrown violently through the air. By the sheer atmospheric pressure, Sion let out a raw scream of agony, clutching his head in desperation as his eardrums threatened to burst from the deafening noise. As the colossal dust cloud finally began to settle, Sion dragged himself up, desperately blinking away the grime to comprehend what had happened to the magma behemoth and to discern the identity of the mysterious, silver-haired warrior. Standing effortlessly before the completely annihilated remains of the lava monster, the enigmatic old man stood perfectly upright, entirely unblemished and without a single scratch on his person. Seon realized in an instant that this newcomer was not an ordinary awakened. He existed on an entirely different, unfathomable echelon of power. The old man turned his head, his crimson eyes locking onto Seon with a gaze so piercing it felt as though it were physically dissecting his soul. Enveloped in a suffocating, menacing red aura, the stranger took a slow, deliberate step towards Seon, the solid stone floor fracturing to pieces beneath his boots with every movement. With a booming voice that rattled the cavern walls, he coldly demanded to know the boy's identity. Paralyzed by the sheer pressure radiating from the stranger, Seon could only watch in terror as the old man aggressively demanded his name. A macabre, lethal smile stretched across the elder's face as he coldly commanded the boy to answer before he finished counting to 3. The countdown commenced immediately, the number 3 echoing through the cavern like a definitive death sentence. He fluidly transitioned to the number 2, the atmospheric weight in the air multiplying until it became physically insupportable for the young warrior. Reflected in Seon's wide, panicked eyes was the silhouette of the old man, completely primed to execute a lethal strike if his query remained unanswered. As their time ran out, the stranger asked one final time if Seon truly intended to keep his mouth shut, his patience completely exhausted. Seon could only stammer incoherently, totally overwhelmed and crushed by the sheer, suffocating bloodlust radiating from the man. The silver-haired warrior pointed a finger directly at him, thoroughly done with the boy's silence. Yet, just as he was about to lose all restraint, the old man noticed that Seon's ruptured eardrums were finally beginning to recover from the shockwave. With an ice-cold, unyielding expression, he spat out a singular word, sigh that caused the blood in Seon's veins to instantly freeze. Breaking through his paralysis at the absolute last second, Seon began to scream in pure desperation, begging the tyrant to wait and spare his life. Seon! The boy screamed at the top of his lungs, desperately throwing his name into the void to halt the impending strike. The old man paused, a mocking chuckle escaping his lips as he remarked that Seon was an incredibly foolish man. While the young warrior glared back with a mixture of intense resentment and fear, the ambient air between them suddenly distorted violently, a dense crimson energy enveloping both of their bodies. The stranger formally introduced himself as Theor, leaving Seon completely dazed and overwhelmed by the abrupt revelation. Massaging his throbbing temples, Seon bitterly complained about being called a fool, demanding to know why the old man insisted on constantly threatening his life. The man, also known as Day Odin, looked down at him with a volatile mixture of pity and absolute disdain before beginning to explain the true gravity of their situation. Seon struggled to process the information, feeling a strange sense of gratitude for having his life saved, yet deeply agitated by the old man's abusive demeanor. Day Odin explained that they had inadvertently tumbled into an anomaly, known as a Desnar, a lethal spatial trap. He revealed that this catastrophic phenomenon occurs exclusively when a subterranean dungeon suffers a massive mana overload and violently seeks a physical outlet. That volatile excess of raw cosmic energy tears open localized spatial rifts, ruthlessly dragging any living entity in the vicinity down into the abyss, which was precisely how they had both ended up stranded in this volcanic trench. Seon internally cursed his horrific luck, the mocking laughter of Supervisor Manhwa flashing through his mind as he fully assimilated just how incredibly screwed he was in this forgotten hole. Crayon callously called him an idiot with complete nonchalance, causing Seon to completely lose his temper, and furiously demand that the old man stop throwing insults at him. Completely ignoring the boy's protests, Crayon lunged forward with blinding speed, gripping Seon's face with bone-crushing force and commanding him to concentrate, his raw mana directly into his eyes to perceive actual reality. Seon attempted to violently break free, but the intense, suffocating glare of the elder forced him into immediate submission, compelling him to forcefully increase the purity of the mana coursing toward his pupils. Crayon harshly instructed him to entirely abandon his physical sight and begin perceiving the surrounding environment exclusively through the structural waves of pure mana energy. Suddenly, Seon's entire visual field shifted drastically, peeling away the physical layer of the cavern to reveal the true, terrifying energetic anatomy of the world around him. The young warrior gasped for air as a horrific realization struck him. Seeing the true monstrosity that lay hidden beneath the volcanic radiance and recognizing that Crayon had been telling the absolute truth, the elder explained that they were currently being hunted by a crimson sand dragon, a lethal apex predator equipped with advanced, supernatural camouflage capabilities that allowed it to systematically devour its prey before they could even register a single trace of danger. Seon shuddered to his very core, horrified by the realization that he had been standing directly under the nose of such a cataclysmic entity, without sensing even a microscopic trace of hostile presence. He realized with absolute clarity that if it weren't for the timely, brutal intervention of this eccentric warrior, he would currently be nothing more than a digested corpse, his eyes reflecting a complex mix of profound relief and frustration at knowing this terrifying stranger had already saved his life twice, in a matter of minutes. Staring at Crayon with deep intensity, he wondered what immense, godlike power lay hidden beneath the old man's wild, unkempt appearance. When Sion cautiously asked for his true identity, Crayon grew intensely impatient, sharply reminding him with absolute disdain that he had already introduced himself previously as Daeon. Sion completely lost his composure, screaming at the top of his lungs to demand who on earth this old psychopath truly was to wield such world-altering power, and where exactly they were trapped. The silver-haired warrior didn't even blink, responding with absolute, chilling calmness that they were trapped inside a living dungeon, an environment he now officially considered his personal, private hunting ground. Unleashing a wild, predatory laugh that echoed ominously through the cavern, he darkly warned Sion that he had better start utilizing those newly awakened eyes of his to perceive reality on his own terms. He officially introduced himself as Crayon, the grand, imposing design of his dark cloak billowing around him to signal that he was no ordinary elder. Without a single word of warning, a massive explosion of pure, concentrated energy violently struck the rocky ground, unleashing torrents of white-hot flame in every direction. Sion clamped his hands over his ears, screaming in pain as he tried to withstand the immense, kinetic shockwave that nearly left him permanently deaf. Struggling to lift his head through the blinding smoke, he stared in utter bewilderment at what the old madman had just done, completely unable to fathom what kind of twisted game he was playing. Suddenly, a massive, swirling enswarmment of monstrous birds cloaked in volatile fire descended from the high ceiling of the cavern, launching themselves directly towards Sion like a barrage of living, flaming projectiles. Sion froze in absolute horror for a fraction of a second as the roaring flames closed in around him, instantly recognizing that he was facing a lethal crisis. From a distance, Crayon's booming voice echoed through the inferno, coldly shouting that if the boy truly possessed any worth as an awakened, he had better survive by his own meager talents, without expecting a single shred of external assistance. The firebirds moved at an apocalyptic velocity, their movements appearing as nothing more than a blur to Sion's normal vision as he furiously cursed the old man for dragging him into this slaughter. Grinding his teeth, he attempted to throw himself into a defensive martial stance, but a wave of acute frustration washed over him as he realized the speed of these avian monsters was entirely out of this world. One of the flaming creatures zipped past his face at a blinding speed, leaving a scorching trail of embers that nearly seared the skin from his cheek. He threw his body into a series of desperate dodges, but the terrain had transformed into a chaotic matrix of exploding sparks and relentless, synchronized attacks that didn't afford him a single microsecond of breathing room. He realized with absolute dread that running away was no longer a viable option. The monstrous flock had completely encircled him, and for some inexplicable, sinister reason, they were relentlessly concentrating their lethal dives directly against his exposed left flank. He unleashed a desperate, wild backhand to bat one of the creatures away, but the strikes were constant, calculated, and entirely suffocating. The firebirds sliced through the sulphurous air like streaks of jagged red lightning, making it physically impossible to track their trajectories with standard human sight. Sion let out a raw scream of agony as several impacts connected with his torso, his physical reserves rapidly hitting their absolute limit as he struggled to defend himself against an enemy he couldn't even see. With his face heavily drenched in blood from multiple lacerations, a grim understanding settled over him. Neither his unrefined sand manipulation nor his current physical vision was capable of keeping pace with the lethal rhythm of the flock. He felt completely cornered in the oppressive darkness, fully aware that if he didn't fundamentally alter his perception immediately, this volcanic cavern would become his tomb. He recalled how the eccentric old man had already saved his life twice, and a wave of profound self-loathing washed over him at his utter inability to stand on his own 2 feet. Suddenly, Crayon's booming voice cut through the chaos, demanding to know if Sion intended to die in silence, or if he was finally going to react like a true warrior. The elder pointed at him with unmitigated disgust, calling him a pathetic brat and openly mocking his inability to fight back while Sion's ears rang with deafening tinnitus. On the ash-covered floor, fresh blood began to actively drip from Sion's strained eyes, his thoughts narrowing into a singular obsessive focus. He had to find a way to see the invisible. As the fiery predators continued to systematically tear at his flesh, Sion forced his mind into a state of absolute, desperate concentration, knowing he needed a radical plan. Shielding his face with his forearms to protect his remaining vision, he heard Crayon roar through the flames, vowing to demonstrate exactly why. Sion was a fool who had no understanding of how to wield his own awakened power. The elder commanded him to entirely stop relying on his fragile physical eyes, to forcefully gather his raw mana into his ocular nerves, and to violently elevate the internal purity of his energy. Concentrating with an intensity that threatened to fracture his mind, Sion's left eye suddenly erupted with a brilliant, blinding golden luminescence as a stream of blood coursed down his cheek. It was time to truly feel the mana. One of the ape, Sion managed to counterattack with absolute precision. Internally astonished by the uncanny level of combat prediction the old man was forcefully hammering into his instincts. Dodging a lethal swipe, he couldn't help but wonder if Crayon had meticulously foreseen this rapid growth from the exact moment he callously threw him into the meat grinder. Suddenly, the entire scale of danger expanded, exponentially as a truly gargantuan monster manifested from the shadows, leaving Sion completely jaw-dropped before the unmitigated, true power of the subterranean dungeon. Crayon, far from being intimidated, launched himself straight into the assault while laughing like an absolute maniac, loudly admitting that it had been a very long time since he had felt this incredibly exhilarated. The cataclysmic clash of their opposing forces was so monstrous that a towering column of blinding light and liquid fire instantly illuminated the entire cavern, causing the solid stone floor to violently buckle and collapse into the void. The silver-haired elder flashed a predatory, bloodthirsty smile, furiously demanding more resistance from his gargantuan opponent as he fully surrendered, his mind and body to the ecstasy of the battle. He leapt recklessly into the deep, churning abyss where the massive crimson drake awaited him, openly daring the legendary creature to keep giving him everything it had. Crayon descended with a shattering, demolidor force directly onto the massive back of the behemoth, his heavy boots impacting the dense stone scales with the explicit intent to systematically crush it to pieces. Upon realizing that the terrifying monster could barely withstand the initial kinetic weight of his strike, Crayon muttered with deep, unyielding dispracio that the entire situation was a profound disappointment. Standing tall with his massive sword in hand, his gaze turning ice cold, it became blindingly obvious that to a living legend like him, this fearsome B-rank dungeon boss was absolutely nothing more than a casual, trivial warm-up. Crayon casually walked away from the twitching carcass as if he had just finished a casual stroll, loudly complaining that he was barely even starting to get warm, and that there were simply no decent monsters left to hunt in this world. Sion watched the surreal display from a distance, fresh blood still actively drying across his bruised face, internally concluding that the old man was completely and utterly insane for feeling genuine pity toward the lethal beasts he had just brutally slaughtered. The young warrior stared blankly at the massive, smoking crater and the scattered remnants of the fallen monsters, forced to accept that the sheer level of destruction Crayon wielded was simply absurd. Forcing a nervous, shaky laugh, Sion asked aloud to the empty air if the nightmare was finally over, praying with every fiber of his being that another monstrosity wouldn't emerge from the smog. However, a sudden, violent jolt of pure survival instinct caused his heart to violently lurch in his chest, and the color completely drained from his face. He knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that something infinitely worse was coming their way. A deafening, apocalyptic rumble violently shook the foundational pillars of the cavern, physically fracturing the ambient air with an insupportable, suffocating atmospheric pressure. Sion desperately grit his teeth and forced his trembling legs to hold his weight. But the raw acoustic frequency was so violently intense that he could feel his internal organs vibrating within his torso. The raw physical impact of the sonic wave was so brutal that his body collapsed entirely, leaving him violently vomiting onto the ash-covered floor, completely incapacitated and paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the roar. While the boy desperately struggled to recover his breath, Crayon stood nearby in total chilling calmness, quietly clarifying that the terrifying sound belonged exclusively to the definitive final boss of the dungeon, a colossal, mountain-sized paw heavily covered in pulsing veins of liquid. Magma slammed down onto the shattered rocks, as the elder calmly explained that every single high-tier calabozo possesses a singular principal energy core. Emerging from a swirling vortex of deep blue flames and oppressive shadows, a gargantuan Alada silhouette slowly materialized. The exact, sacred reason Crayon had intentionally broken into this hellish dungeon in the first place. Sion plummeted into an absolute, hyperventilating panic upon witnessing the astronomical scale of the creature, stammering incoherently as his mind fractured before the oppressive presence of such a legendary boss. Crayon, by contrast, let out a booming laugh, a massive smile stretching from ear to ear as he celebrated the fact that his grand opponent had finally decided to show its face. The magnificent Crimson Rex surged completely out of the burning abyss, fully enveloped in a violent torrent of blazing blue fire that completely illuminated the cavernous void. The two humans appeared utterly microscopic against the staggering scale of the Titan. which loomed over them like a literal mountain of hardened scales and cosmic flame. Sion desperately asked if the entity was a true dragon, but the elder sharply corrected him, stating it was a high-tier drake and confirming that it was, at the bare minimum, a formidable, B-rank threat. A dense sphere of brilliant blue, mana began to glow with blinding intensity within the beast's maw, confirming that this was no ordinary creature. Sion immediately noticed the shifting energy currents surrounding the Colossus, realizing with absolute horror that the drake had actively deployed an impenetrable, magical force field around its entire body. Crayon playfully patted the boy on the head, genuinely surprised that a broken Lisiado, like him, possessed the tactical knowledge to recognize advanced fields of force. Seon hastily explained that he had read extensively about how B-rank monsters possess entirely unique evolutionary traits, adding that the shimmering, red undercurrents indicated the beast possessed a highly destructive, martial classification. Massive fragments of raw mana began to physically crystallize in the open air from the sheer, staggering weight of the magical pressure radiating from the enemy. The drake unleashed a devastating, sweeping blast of pure kinetic energy that completely wiped the battlefield, making it explicitly clear that its power existed on an entirely separate echelon of destruction. Sion let out a desperate, panicked scream upon confirming that the beast was a magical type, a classification that made it 1,000 times more volatile, dangerous, and completely unbalanced for an ordinary human to face. Without wasting a single microsecond, Crayon launched his body directly into the open air, flying straight toward the massive head of the Colossus in total defiance of gravity and logic. Titanic boulders began to break free from the cavern's ceiling, raining down into the inferno as Sion could only look upward in absolute terror. He felt with absolute clarity that his entire lifetime of street survival and basic common sense was completely worthless in the face of this apocalyptic clash of titans. The drake tore its massive jaws open, rapidly condensing a catastrophic shot of pure blue mana just as Crayon materialized mere inches from its snout. In a flash of pure unbridled dominance, the silver-haired elder unleashed a brutal, vertical Teijo of blinding white energy so immensely powerful that it literally seemed to cleave the very fabric of the air, and the monster's skull in two. The drake's massive talons clawed frantically against the canyon walls as it desperately attempted to defend its life against the implacable, razor-sharp assault of the legendary swordsman. Crayon moved through the burning smog like a bolt of plateado lightning, systematically shredding the impenetrable scales of the beast with his massive sword. Unleashing a ferocious battle cry, the old man continued to press his advantage, thoroughly savoring every single second of the high-stakes combat to the death. The colossal monster desperately began to condense magical energy within its maw once more, attempting to completely pulverize the maddened human hovering above its face. Crayon's expression was the absolute raw definition of pure insanity. His teeth were fiercely bared in a grimace of unadulterated euphoria, just as a massive explosion of blue mana completely enveloped both combatants, causing the entire dungeon structure to tremble violently. Amidst the blinding chaos, the old man's manic laughter echoed effortlessly through the flames, mockingly asking the drake if the strike hurt, and openly deriding its agony. Gripping his massive sword with even more bone-crushing force, he promised the thrashing monster that he would personally take it upon himself to put a definitive end to its suffering. The entire battlefield had transformed into a catastrophic disaster, zone of shattered boulders and highly volatile residual energy. Crayon coldly delivered his final sentence, proclaiming that today would mark the creature's official funeral. Sion, weeping from pure, unadulterated terror as he lay exposed on the rocks, could only think that today was actually going to be his own funeral for being trapped in the crossfire of these monsters. The dying drake began to erratically fire catastrophic blasts of magical energy in every conceivable direction, forcing the terrified boy to scramble for his life across the debris, frantically screaming that they should just sit down and talk through their problems like civilized beings. A massive, localized explosion detonated mere inches from his position, launching his body violently through the air as the fragile stone floor beneath his boots completely disintegrated into nothingness. Sion plummeted straight down into the absolute, bottomless void of the chasm, unleashing a raw, agonizing scream as he watched the glowing battlefield rapidly recede above him. His heavy combat boots hung suspended in the empty air for a fleeting second. He simply couldn't believe that mere atmospheric shockwaves from their clash had thrown his life into such absolute misery. He grit his teeth hard, looking upward with a profound mixture of visceral horror and complete helplessness before the terrifying magnitude of the disaster. Crayon, by contrast, was entirely in his element, laughing at the top of his lungs with absolute madness, while proudly proclaiming how incredibly fun the slaughter had become. The ancient warrior clung fiercely to the head of the thrashing drake as if it were a thrilling amusement park ride, screaming his defiance straight into the beast's fading eyes. The apocalyptic confrontation triggered a final, catastrophic explosion of fire and cosmic energy that fully illuminated the cavern, permanently transforming the subterranean sector into a literal living hell. Sion desperately tried to maintain his equilibrium on a violently tilting platform of stone, surrounded on all sides by stray lances of magical energy that systematically swept the chamber. His pupils dilated in absolute panic as he realized the narrow ledge beneath his feet had finally surrendered to the sheer kinetic violence of the battle. He only managed to spit out one final, bitter curse before absolute panic swallowed his consciousness whole. The young warrior vanished entirely into the heavy darkness of a deep, jagged fissure swallowed completely by the subterranean entrails of the dungeon. His battered body bounced violently against the icy stone walls of the shaft as he plummeted, entirely out of control into the deep unknown. Following a terrifying high-velocity descent through the tight stone tunnel, Sion was violently shot out into the open air, falling helplessly through a colossal subterranean space. Droplets of his own blood floated serenely around his face in the weightless vacuum as he watched with total incredulity, recognizing that his fragile life was currently hanging by a microscopic thread. Reflected in his wide eyes was the fading chaos of the titanic battle he had left behind, his mind struggling to process the absolute madness of the last few minutes. Falling headfirst into the yawning abyss, Sion could see the distant, glowing silhouettes of Crayon and the Drake, continuing their savage duel to the death, both entities completely ignoring his descent. Crayon laughed straight into the face of the bleeding Crimson Drake, mockingly asking if this pathetic display was truly the absolute limit of a legendary dungeon boss. The monster was completely cornered, and the Elder openly taunted it, stating that the prestigious title of boss was far too grand for such a weak creature. However, the ancient beast refused to go down quietly, forcefully concentrating a massive, unprecedented pool of magical energy within its throat. Far from being intimidated by the impending blast, Crayon looked genuinely impressed that the beast was actually capable of pulling off new tricks at the end of its life. The Drake unleashed a concentrated beam of pure energy that effortlessly pierced the absolute darkness of the cavern. The immense impact, generating a catastrophic explosion that caused every single corner of the subterranean world to violently buckle. The massive monster scanned the dense smoke, confidently expecting to have completely vaporized the infuriating human. "Were you looking for me?" Crayon's booming voice suddenly echoed from the shadows, materializing out of thin air directly above the beast's head. The Elder's massive sword began to pulse with a menacing, brilliant red energy, causing the Drake to roar in sudden, desperate panic as it felt the cold shadow of its impending demise close in. Crayon calmly confessed to the thrashing monster that he had spent an entire, grueling year tracking its footsteps across the burning expanse of the outer desert specifically to corner it in this hole. It turned out that this entire elaborate theater of slaughter was orchestrated for the sole purpose of Templar, his legendary blade, an ancient weapon that, by sheer coincidence, shared the exact same name as him. Locking his crimson eyes onto the beast with a freezing, merciless glare, he told the Colossus that it was finally time to close its eyes and die. He drove the massive sword violently into the core of the monster's skull, releasing a catastrophic discharge of raw mana that shattered the structural integrity of the surrounding cavern. The strike was so monumentally brutal that the mighty Crimson Drake was completely and utterly annihilated beneath the Elder's overwhelming power. The ancient weapon actively absorbed the massive torrent of residual energy from the combat, vibrating with an intense, karmazy radiance as the mystical runes etched into the flat of the blade illuminated one by one, confirming that the tempering process was an absolute success. Crayon observed the surrounding chaos with supreme satisfaction as the very walls of the high dungeon began to systematically collapse into dust. The sword threw off a dense, dark aura, almost as if the weapon itself were actively celebrating the monumental victory. The old man held the hilt with an iron grip, thoroughly satisfied with the bloody outcome of his hunt, laughing softly to himself as he openly congratulated his blade for becoming stronger. Yes, the old man had definitely lost his mind. Seon observed the surreal scene from a crumpled heap in a distant corner of the cavern, entirely convinced that his eccentric mentor was nothing more than a dangerous, lunatic old man who spoke to inanimate objects. Crayon slowly walked over to the edge of the fresh crater, peering down at the boy and mockingly chuckling, genuinely surprised that the pathetic piece of an idiot was still actively breathing. The young protagonist was entirely at his physical limit, his body covered in makeshift bandages and lacking even the microscopic strength required to lift his own limbs. Without warning, the structurally compromised ceiling began to cave in completely, and Sion was thrown across the stone floor by the sheer force of the expanding shockwave. His eyes snapped wide open as he watched his entire world literally collapse on top of his head, forcing him to tightly cover his ears to avoid being permanently deafened by the cataclysmic roar of falling boulders. Searing escombros flew violently through the air in every direction, leaving Sion with nothing left to do but prayed to the universe that he wouldn't be completely crushed into paste beneath the stones. He tumbled helplessly across the jagged ground, completely at the mercy of gravity and the chaotic, kinetic forces tearing the chamber apart. Gasping for air and entirely coated in thick volcanic dust, he slowly realized that through some absolute, miraculous stroke of divine fortune, he had somehow managed to survive the collapse. Crayon approached him with a slow, completely unbothered stride, casually remarking that getting blasted by his residual shockwaves had clearly improved the boy's sluggish reflexes. He ruthlessly grabbed Sion by his collar, lifting him into the air like a piece of discarded garbage, and flatly warned him that the entire dungeon was going to completely collapse into solid rock at any second. Sion, paralyzed with exhaustion and fear, could only manage to weakly ask why on earth the old man insisted on carrying him in such a profoundly humiliating, undignified manner. The old man's only response was a manic, echoing laugh that reverberated through the crumbling tunnels. "Goodbye, you absolute piece of an idiot!" Crayon roared at the top of his lungs as he violently hurled Sion's body straight into a shimmering, unstable dimensional rift that had torn open in the rock. Sion soared through the open air, furiously screaming a torrent of bitter insults at the silver-haired tyrant. With every ounce of breath left in his lungs, from one microsecond to the next, the volatile portal violently spat him out into the absolute middle of nowhere. He landed face first into a vast expanse of burning, hot sand, forcefully swallowing a mouthful of dirt after such a cataclysmic transit. He dragged his battered torso upward, spitting out the dry grit and furiously demanding to know where they had ended up, to which Crayon simply responded with total nonchalance that they were finally outside the dungeon. Suddenly, the eccentric old man's demeanor turned incredibly serious for a fleeting second, commanding the young warrior to pay close, undivided attention to his next words. He flatly stated that he strictly required Sion's unique ability to manipulate the volcanic sand and ash, but noted with brutal honesty that the boy was currently far too weak to be of any actual tactical use to him. Crayon pointed a thick finger toward the endless, shimmering horizon, delivering a definitive ultimatum. Sion could either return to his miserable, uninspired existence back in the slums of Neo Seoul, or he could choose to finally accept his grand destiny. Crayon looked him dead in the eyes, asking if he was willing to follow his footsteps to stop being a useless nobody and finally forge himself into someone of real substance. Sion was completely bewildered by the sudden proposition, his mind racing as he cautiously asked exactly how long he would have to follow him. The old man simply shrugged, stating he had absolutely no idea. It could be a matter of months, several years, or perhaps even decades. But the definitive offer was on the table and he had to make his choice right now. The choices before him were stark and simple. Return to the comfortable, predictable misery of his past life, or gamble his entire existence on a brutal path, where there was a 99% probability of an swirling vortexes of fine desert sand whipped violently around Sion's boots, his mind anchoring onto the absolute, unyielding conviction that if he committed to following this terrifying old man, he would inevitably ascend to become the strongest warrior of them all. That very confidence will be the exact reason you will one day face bitter, suffocating regret. Crayon darkly warned him, a macabre, ghastly smile stretching across his weathered face. Without wasting a single microsecond to let the ominous words sink in, the silver-haired veteran turned on his heel and set a punishing, relentless pace, coldly commanding the young boy to keep up. The journey before them was excruciatingly long. They commenced their grueling march beneath a merciless, bleeding sun that beat down upon the arid wasteland, the treacherous desert terrain extending outward into a terrifying, infinite void. Not even a few standard hours had elapsed before Sion was already gasping for oxygen, desperately screaming through cracked lips for the old man to slow down his inhuman stride. After 6 straight hours of continuous walking across the undulating dunes, Sion found himself hovering on the absolute precipice of a total physical collapse, pathetically supplicando for a single moment of rest. Yet, Crayon continued moving forward, like a mechanical monolith without uttering a single syllable, completely and utterly ignoring the boy's desperate, agonizing lorikeos. Sion exploded in pure, unadulterated frustration, utterly incapable of comprehending how the old man's volatile humor could shift so erratically and dangerously from one moment to the next. The ambient heat radiating from the sky was entirely insupportable, with Sion rapidly calculating that the temperature must easily be hovering around 50 scorching degrees Celsius at the bare minimum. Every single step plunge into the loose sand felt like an exquisite form of torture, his feet burning as though he were systematically sinking into a bed of glowing, red-hot embers. Entirely exhausted, suffocated, and stripped of his breath, Sion abruptly halted his advance. Crayon stopped, turning his head to look back with deep disdain as he callously called the boy an idiot, flatly stating that he wasn't even utilizing a microscopic 1% of his true awakened power. The elder dryly explained that it was a pathetic, embarrassing sight for an individual blessed with the unique authority to manipulate sand, to face such humiliating difficulties simply walking across it. Sion fiercely barked back, screaming that he had literally just awakened. His supernatural powers and that controlling a volatile element was infinitely more complex than it appeared to an outsider. Crayon merely narrowed his eyes, his gaze dripping with cold desprecio as he ruthlessly countered, "And why on earth should that matter?" Attempting to justify his weakness, Sion argued that he was officially classified as nothing more than a bottom-tier F-rank awakened, not a high-ranking monstrosity capable of defying nature like the old man. Crayon completely lost his remaining patience, furiously roaring at the boy to shut his mouth and stop spewing such cowardly stupidities. Reaching out with blinding velocity, he grabbed Sion roughly by the collar of his shirt, hoisting his entire body into the air with terrifying, effortless strength. "Do you honestly believe that anyone is just born as a legendary S-rank?" The old man snarled, his menacing face positioned a mere centimeter from Sion's panicked eyes. He darkly added that to the eyes of the rest of the world, a street rat like him was already baseline afortunato just to have awakened a manipulation attribute. Those cold, blunt words left Sion completely descolocado, his mind fracturing at the bizarre notion of being considered fortunate. Crayon callously dropped him back into the hot dirt, commanding him to stop his pathetic complaining and finally start using his brain to figure out how to utilize his unique abilities in a practical manner. Sion sat frozen in the sand, blankly staring down at his trembling hands, as he systematically processed the intense, violent lecture he had just received. The old man made it explicitly clear that he needed to aggressively employ his intellect to break through his physical limits and grow, entirely on his own terms. Before Sion could even stand, Crayon grabbed him once more, his grip infinitely more aggressive and violent than before, as he darkly warned the boy that if he didn't violently espabular and awaken his survival instincts, this unforgiving desert would gladly swallow him alive. Sion could barely manage an incoherent balbucio, desperately begging the tyrant to let him go. Gritting teeth in pure defiance, Sion forced his entire mental focus downward, concentrating every shred of his residual mana directly into the shifting desert sand, resting beneath his combat boots. Suddenly, the terrain reacted violently to his desperation, and massive, razor-sharp lances of solid sand erupted furiously from the ground in every direction, impaling the empty air. Witnessing the sudden outbreak of power, Crayon gave a slow nod, murmuring that the brat did indeed possess a sliver of genuine potential. Sion rapidly calculated the exact operational radius of his elemental authority, instantly realizing that he could currently only manipulate the sand within a strict 5-meter boundary, a remarkably small area, but one that would have to suffice for his immediate survival. His most glaring, energy-draining problem was that his heavy boots continued to plunge up to his ankles with every single stride he took across the dunes. He recognized that if he could somehow engineer a permanent solution to this physical drag, he would be able to conserve a massive amount of life-saving energy. Suddenly, a brilliant, innovative idea flashed through his mind. What if he actively condensed the shifting sand particles directly beneath the soles of his boots, packing them so tightly with mana that they became as immovably subtle and solid as poured cement? He immediately put the theory into practice, and it worked to absolute perfection. Sion began to sprint and leap across the massive dunes with an astonishing, fluid ease, feeling as light as a stray feather as he glided effortlessly over the terrain. However, his sudden surge of joy was short-lived. He rapidly noticed that the continuous expenditure of mana required to crystallize the sand was astronomically high, making it entirely impossible to sustain over a long-term journey. Realizing he had to immediately discard the technique, he rapidly engineered a variation, choosing instead to concentrate the raw mana currents directly into his leg muscles to physically impulse his strides forward, instantly noting that walking across the blistering desert became infinitely simpler. Crayon observed his frantic experimentation in absolute silence, a cynical, knowing smile playing on his lips, as he softly muttered to himself about how deeply enviable the raw vitality of youth truly was. Despite his constant tactical failures, stumbling steps and ungraceful falls, Sion fiercely refused to surrender to exhaustion. That unyielding perseverance was, in the old man's internal estimation, the greatest privilege of being young. Crayon silently admitted to himself that although the boy was officially registered as an F rank, his intuitive manipulation of mana currents was already operating at the definitive level of an E rank or perhaps even a C rank hunter. Suddenly, through sheer force of will, Sion achieved the breakthrough. He managed to perfectly stabilize his stride, utilizing only the exact, microscopic amount of energy necessary to glide over the sand, and immediately began to loudly presumere of his success. He began to run in arrogant circles completely around the walking elder, loudly shouting for the old man to look at how brilliantly he was performing. He had discovered the flawless equilibrium, controlling exclusively the thin layer of sand that directly impacted his feet. Sion began to shamelessly burlesque of Crayon, smugly asking if a clumsy old man like him was truly capable of executing such a refined technique with such absolute comfort. He was completely crescidissimo, his arrogance reaching a fever pitch. But absolute suburbia always extracts a swift and violent price. Before he could even finish his mocking sentence, Seon was struck by a blinding, heavy blow to the back of his head that sent his body crashing directly into the hot sand. Crayon stared down at his prone form, deeply fastidiado by the boy's unnecessary, annoying fluttering. He coldly warned the dazed youth never to waste his precious energy on stupid vanities if he had any desire to avoid dying of pure exhaustion. Seon lay semi-unconscious in the sand, a massive, throbbing chichon rapidly swelling on his skull, as the veteran furiously screamed at him to breathe and get his ass back up immediately because they had absolutely no time to waste. Seon slowly blinked his eyes open with immense difficulty, his mind feeling completely disorientado and shattered as he desperately tried to discern where on earth he was. Crayon, sitting comfortably nearby with his colossal sword resting across his back, looked down at him with unmitigated disdain, dryly remarking that it was about damn time the idiot finally decided to wake up. Seon attempted to weakly complain, muttering that his entire physical body felt systematically destrozado and reminding the old man that they weren't exactly resting in a luxury hotel room. Without offering a single word of comfort, the veteran callously flipped a tough piece of dried meat through the air, letting it land in the dirt directly in front of the boy's face. As Seon lay paralyzed on the ground, Crayon began to quietly recount a distant story from his own youth, his rough voice drifting through the quiet expanse. The veteran nostalgically recalled an ancient era when basic survival wasn't a constant, desperate struggle, and when protecting the fragile and weak was considered a deeply noble, sacred pursuit. While listening to the old man's historical musings, Seon bitterly bit into the dried ration, discovering to his horror that the meat was as local and hard as thick leather. Crayon abruptly stood up, delivering a cold, unyielding ultimatum. The boy could either force himself up on his own 2 feet right now, or he could happily choose to lie there and die in absolute comfort. Making a borderline superhuman physical effort, the boy dragged himself into a sitting position and desperately forced down whatever scraps of the food he could swallow. He stared blankly out toward the infinite horizon, deeply processing the old man's profound words regarding the nature of the ancient world. Seon silently reflected on the terrifying longevidad of his mentor, wondering about the sheer weight of memories someone who had lived through centuries must permanently carry within their soul. He casually glanced over to note that Crayon was still systematically consuming his own ration, but he suddenly realized that the elder wasn't actually chewing the leather-hard meat. Instead, he was strategically softening it within his mouth, using his own saliva to conserve fluids. The young warrior instantly understood that in this unforgiving desert wasteland, every single microscopic drop of moisture counted, feeling a sudden wave of annoyance that the old man hadn't bothered to explain that practical trick to him beforehand. He was beginning to see the true nature of Crayon's tutelage. The old man would never hand him anything on a silver platter, choosing instead to forcefully teach him how to buscarse la vida on his own terms. Still, looking out over the endless dunes, Seon silently admitted to himself that despite all the grand epics and stories he had heard, he had never once in his life seen a real, living fish. Seon gathered his courage to loudly demand another piece of meat, but he was immediately met with a definitive roaring "shut up" as his answer. Suddenly, the brutal dropping temperature of the desert night took its toll, and Seon unleashed a violent estornudo that echoed loudly through the absolute stillness of the wasteland. Trembling uncontrollably from head to toe, he bitterly complained about how profoundly gelidous and freezing the desert nights were, while Crayon casually stretched his limbs as if they were resting in a balmy paradise. To make matters infinitely worse, Seon hadn't been able to catch a single second of sleep, because the eccentric old man had spent the entire night actively having a full conversation with his own sword, dead from a suffocating thirst. Seon desperately scanned their campsite for a single drop of water, only to witness Crayon meticulously retorciendo his own damp outer garments over a small container. He realized with sudden fury that the old man had strategically spread his heavy gear across the sand during the night to collect the morning dew, selfishly drinking the harvested moisture all by himself in complete secrecy. Seon tried to desperately imitate the survival trick by pathetically licking the sweat and moisture from his own arm, fiercely swearing a silent blood oath that he would extract his vengeance the exact second he became stronger. Crayon glanced over, calling him a pathetic piece of an animal before coldly asking if he could already feel what was coming their way. The boy froze completely in blanco, his mind utterly failing to understand what his mentor was referring to. It was at that exact microsecond that Seon's senses finally registered a series of low, rhythmic vibraciones radiating directly from the deep, subterranean layers of the ground. The expression on his face instantly twisted into pure dread as he realized that this was not the approach of a single, stray creature, but rather the synchronized movement of something infinitely larger. Out from the oppressive darkness of the breaking dawn, dozens upon dozens of glowing red eyes began to materialize, systematically encircling their position from every conceivable direction. Crayon rapidly identified the threat, calmly noting that a massive pack of high-horned desert hyenas had successfully cornered them at the first light of morning. The elder gave a taunting smile, mockingly asking the boy if he truly believed he could survive this gauntlet entirely on his own, or if he was going to pathetically beg for his assistance once again. The monstrous beasts bared their razor-sharp colmillo, unleashing a chorus of menacing, guttural grunyidos as they coiled their muscles to spring forward for the slaughter. Flashing a defiant, razor-sharp smile of his own, Sion pointed a finger directly at the old man, and fiercely declared that he didn't need a single shred of his help to handle this trash. He was fully determined, eager to definitively prove that he could control the situation under his own power. His eyes suddenly erupted with a brilliant, golden mana luminescence as he concentrated his entire energy reserve for the opening strike. In a single flash of movement, the boy launched himself directly into the absolute epicenter of the pack, completely surrounded by a sea of starving, bloodthirsty hyenas. His intense golden gaze swept the battlefield, desperately searching for a microscopic apertura among the shifting monsters. He began to furiously invoke sharp lanzas of solid sand from the ground to defend his life. But the horned hyenas continued to emerge from the dunes without end. He let out a frustrated scream upon realizing that their numbers were simply too vast, recognizing with sudden dread that if he continued to blindly expend his energy, he would run completely out of mana long before they ever even managed to bite him. He recognized that he desperately required an immediate, strategic plan. Pure brute force was entirely worthless against an army of attrition. He forced his mind into a state of maximum concentration, trying to engineer a method to slaughter the beasts while expending the absolute minimum amount of baseline energy. Just as a massive hyena launched itself into the air to ambush him from his blind spot, Sion maintained absolute calmness, systematically analyzing every microscopic trajectory. He spun on his heel and delivered a devastating, heavy blow straight to the jaw of the leaping beast, furiously screaming for the monster to stop interrupting his internal thoughts. However, the savage creature managed to sink its teeth into his flesh before falling, and Sion found himself blankly staring down at the bleeding agujero, left in his arm with an expression of intense, unadulterated anger. His mind briefly processed the old man's previous cryptic comment regarding ventilation holes as fresh blood began to actively drip onto the sand. The remainder of the ravenous pack refused to afford him a single microsecond of breathing room, launching themselves straight at his torso with bared teeth. Completely surrounded and cut off, Sion stood perfectly still in the absolute center of the desert, freezing reality for a single second to analyze the chessboard. Suddenly, the realization hit him like a physical blow. If the primary issue holding his combat efficiency back was the creation of holes, then the solution was beautifully simple. He just needed to start putting holes into them. No sooner said than done. The protagonist unleashed a devastating barrage of hyper-concentrated mana, Raffigas that effortlessly sliced through the charging hyenas as if their bodies were made of fragile paper. Completely losing his remaining sanity to the thrill of the slaughter, Sion broke into a wild, maniacal laugh as he watched the severed heads of the monstrous beasts go flying through the open air. He continued to ruthlessly reparty Erlenia across the battlefield, his mind anchoring onto the fundamental combat truth that in a battle of survival, mana is literal life, and he could not afford to waste a single drop of energy. He began to move across the dunes with the cold, absolute precision of a master Cirujano, systematically eliminating the enemies with the absolute minimum amount of physical effort required. Suddenly, a cataclysmic explosion of pure, unadulterated power completely blew his composure, causing him to realize that the old man had finally decided to enter the fray. Crayon had intentionally allowed a truly gargantuan alpha hyena to sink its fangs directly into his arm for the sole purpose of mockingly laughing in its face, loudly jeering that its ultimate attack felt like nothing more than a tickle. A microsecond later, the elder grew thoroughly bored of the beast, locking his gaze onto the monster with a horrifying, psychopathic expression capable of freezing the blood of the bravest men. With an eerie, terrifying tranquility, the old man quietly stated that he had absolutely no intention of leaving a single stray pet alive if it possessed the audacity to bite human beings. A predatory, monstrous smile stretched across his weathered face, making it explicitly clear that what was about to unfold was going to be an absolute massacre. Sion, who was already intimately familiar with the old man's apocalyptic tendencies, immediately turned on his heel and began running like a soul possessed by a demon. Before the old madman could completely Laliparda again, Crayon unleashed a titanic, blood-curdling rugido that caused the entire desert structure to violently tremble, swearing an absolute oath that he would erase the entire pack from the map in a single second. The veteran delivered a monumentally brutal downward strike, shattering the foundational earth and unleashing a massive wave of pure, dark kinetic shockwave that systematically annihilated everything in its path. Poor Sion was thrown violently and the boy answered with a crisp, Resolute, yes, sir. As they systematically prepared to continue their grueling trek through the shifting dunes, the protagonist set off walking, feeling absolutely happy, merrily humming a lighthearted tune under his breath and casually munching on his remaining pieces of dried hyena meat as if the apocalyptic slaughter of the previous morning had never even occurred. He felt deeply satisfied with his current circumstances, knowing he now possessed a massive surplus of food to sustain his body for the long road ahead, even though a persistent, annoying scratchiness still ticked at the back of his throat due to a lingering thirst. Thanks to his brilliant new elemental ability to stabilize the terrain directly beneath his heavy combat boots, advancing across the treacherous desert was no longer a torturing, agonizing punishment, but had instead transformed into a leisurely, comforting stroll. The young man quickly got ahead of himself, letting his ego surge as he began to shamelessly vacilar and tease the brooding veteran, smugly asking if the old man was secretly harboring a deep envy of his fluid agility, or if it was simply a case of the elder becoming far too ancient to keep up with the new generation. Seon laughed out loud, his booming cackles echoing across the desolate plains as he thoroughly enjoyed the moment and basked in the warmth of his newly acquired confidence, while maintaining his brisk stride. In a single moment of careless distraction, the boy suddenly had to violently twist his torso to duck beneath a swift, heavy backhand strike from the veteran that came out of nowhere and almost sent his entire body flying across the sand once again. Crayon let out a long, exhausted sigh, callously calling the boy a complete lunatic while bitterly complaining that while some legendary hunters literally tear their own skin apart just to make a fraction of progress, this arrogant brat was loudly bragging over a baseline perfectly normal skill. Seon, who had ended up with his face forcefully buried deep in the hot sand from his evasive maneuver, muffled a bitter complaint, crying out that he had almost died of pure, suffocating thirst and that the ruthless old man apparently possessed absolutely no mercy or tolerance for a harmless joke. Suddenly, the protagonist froze completely, his playful demeanor vanishing as a stark, intense seriousness washed over his face. He felt a sudden, inexplicable shift in the heavy atmosphere, his nostrils flaring as his senses picked up an impossible scent floating upon the arid breeze. Was that genuine? Pure moisture that he was actively smelling in the middle of a barren wasteland? He anxiously questioned his own sanity, wondering if his desperate mind was merely constructing wild illusions. But the moment his eyes locked onto Crayon, he noticed that the veteran had also halted and was staring intently toward the exact same coordinates on the horizon. Seon's mouth fell wide open in absolute awe as the realization struck him that right behind the massive, towering sand dune directly ahead of them, a genuine, life-saving oasis might actually be waiting to welcome them. Both warriors rapidly ascended to the absolute peak of the towering hill of shifting sand, the howling wind blowing softly across their faces to peel back the curtain of dust and reveal the hidden landscape below. Seon gazed out toward the horizon with an intense burning hope, desperately praying to whatever gods remained that his eyes were not cruelly deceiving him in this notoriously treacherous and manipulative desert environment. It was absolutely not a mirage. Seon screamed at the absolute top of his lungs in pure, unadulterated joy upon witnessing a magnificent sight that, until this very second, he had only ever known through distant rumors and mythical hunter legends. Stretched out magnificently right before their eyes was a beautiful, pristine oasis of crystal clear water, glittering like a collection of raw diamonds beneath the harsh sun, the absolute perfect, divine reward following such a brutal, exhausting gauntlet of combat. Seon immediately slid down the steep face of the sandy dune, shouting with chaotic glee as he celebrated, finally discovering a source of pure water. After days of enduring nothing but oppressive, suffocating heat, Crayon merely observed the boy's frantic descent from the top of the hill, his weathered face showing an expression of intense displeasure, because the hardened veteran knew better than anyone that in the heart of the desert, absolutely nothing is ever given for free. "Finally, it's finally here!" Seon screamed in a frenzy, running like a complete madman straight toward the pristine, inviting shoreline. He was consumed by such a violent, suffocating thirst that his mind was utterly incapable of thinking about anything else, causing him to dive headfirst into the glistening body of water, without a single shred of caution. The sensation of the cool, fresh liquid enveloping his skin was hands down the absolute best thing that had ever happened to him in his entire life. As the water began filtering through his clothes, a profound sense of relief washed over him, the therapeutic chill forcefully restoring his broken soul right back into his physical body after enduring temperatures that easily exceeded 50 grueling degrees. He remained floating there, completely spread-eagled and surrendered to the deep freshness that his body hadn't experienced in consecutive weeks, feeling as though he had discovered a pocket of literal paradise right in the absolute center of a living hell. "I am so incredibly happy, man," he whispered to himself, letting his eyelids droop in total relaxation. But right at that peaceful microsecond, his instinct triggered a bizarre, alarming sensation deep within his gut, and his eyes suddenly snapped open. locking onto a strange anomaly occurring deep beneath the surface of the water. A brilliant, intensely warm light suddenly manifested right in front of him, glowing with a hypnotic, otherworldly luminescence that felt as though it were actively whispering his name and calling him deeper into the abyss. Seon began to feel completely dazed and lightheaded, an overwhelming, unnatural fatigue rapidly conquering his nervous system as his physical limbs suddenly grew as heavy as solid lead. Sass! A deafening, thunderous scream violently shattered the tranquility of the oasis, tearing through his ears with enough force to shatter his trance. "Wake up right this instant, you pathetic piece of an animal!" Crayon roared, charging forward with every ounce of his massive strength, his voice dripping with pure rage as he sprinted like a demon toward the water's edge. Seon could barely manage to lift his heavy head, his vision completely blurry and his mind spinning in a dizzying haze, utterly failing to comprehend why the old man was advancing toward him with such terrifying aggression. It was then that the true, horrific nature of the danger finally unveiled itself beneath the crystal-clear water. This was absolutely not a peaceful, rejuvenating oasis. It was the highly sophisticated, hidden nesting ground of a gargantuan apex predator. Before Seon could even attempt to swim, Crayon reached out, violently grabbing him by the fabric of his clothes and launching his entire body flying completely out of the water with a single, effortless heave of his hand. Boom! A colossal, monstrous fish erupted furiously from the depths, its massive, razor-sharp jaws snapping shut with a terrifying crunch at the exact physical coordinate where Seon's head had been resting a mere microsecond prior. The young boy went sailing through the air like a discarded rag doll, landing heavily on the solid dirt far away from the shoreline. While the veteran seamlessly transitioned into his combat stance, Crayon launched his body directly toward the gaping, terrifying mandibles of the breaching beast, demonstrating a total, absolute lack of fear toward the Leviathan. His hand wrapped firmly around the hilt of his massive sword, he was fully determined to terminate this nuisance with extreme prejudice, so he could return to properly scolding his idiotic novice. Flash! With a single, impeccably clean arc of his blade, the massive monster was neatly severed directly down the middle, its monolithic body exploding into a massive geyser of water and crimson gore. Seon watched the entire spectacle from the dirt, completely soaked from head to toe, and his jaw hanging wide open in sheer disbelief. Wow, that was absolute unadulterated madness. The falling rain of dark monster blood and mist beautifully refracted the harsh sunlight, forming a vibrant, ironic rainbow directly over the massive carcass of the beast. "It's a sand angler," Crayon dryly explained, resting his blade on his shoulder. "It utilizes that hypnotic light to lure unsuspecting prey into its territory, and then swallows them whole." The old man turned his head, staring down at Seon with a menacing, terrifying expression that was infinitely more horrifying than the giant fish he had just slaughtered. Seon swallowed his saliva hard, feeling a cold sweat break out across his neck. A heavy, direct punch slammed squarely into the boy's face without warning. Crayon possessed absolutely zero intention of forgiving the novice for allowing himself to be deceived so effortlessly by a baseline optical illusion. "Where exactly did you discard everything I literally just taught you?" The veteran furiously roared. "Do you honestly believe yourself to be some sort of seasoned expert? Just because you managed to survive out here for a measly couple of days?" The old man was entirely beside himself with rage, his voice echoing across the dunes as he added, "The arrogant fools who let their guard down are always the very first ones to rot in this desert. Does that finally click in your hollow skull, you idiot?" Seon could barely manage to murmur a pathetic yes, while aggressively massaging the painful bruise forming on his face. Crayon let out a long, deeply frustrated sigh, waving his hand dismissively. "Now skin the damn thing," the old man commanded coldly, turning his back and walking away toward the shade. Seon was left entirely alone, blankly staring at the colossal, slimy carcass of the giant creature, without having the slightest clue where to even begin his labor. It was an official C-rank monster, and Crayon casually called out over his shoulder, explaining that the thick, resilient leather situated on its underbelly was absolutely perfect for crafting a brand new desert tunic. Seon blinked in confusion, naively asking aloud if the old man was truly in such desperate need of a new tunic, an innocent question that caused a prominent, pulsing vein to almost violently explode right on Crayon's forehead. "For you absolute blockhead. Fabricate one for your own damn self," the veteran bellowed back, his voice dripping with disbelief as he loudly wondered if the oppressive desert heat had completely melted the boy's baseline brain cells. I'm sorry, Seon offered with a frantic, nervous smile, hurriedly attempting to placate the elder, before he accidentally drove him into another violent fit of rage. The creature truly was an absolute monolith. Crayon quietly observed the anatomy, commenting that its structure bore a striking resemblance to the ancient aquatic fish that used to inhabit the Earth's oceans ages ago. It was the absolute first time Sion had ever laid eyes on such a bizarre creature, and the old man indifferently told him to take this opportunity to study its form or don't. He couldn't care less either way. The young boy stood frozen for a quiet moment, deeply processing the sheer, terrifying scale of the Leviathan and realizing, with a shudder, that he had been a mere second away from becoming its evening dinner. Steeling his resolve, he drew his small survival knife and began to meticulously score the tough hide. Fish are absolutely terrifying, he muttered under his breath, shivering at the thought. Crayon instantly began to mock his agonizingly slow progress from afar. Are you gently caressing the beast? Even a corpse would come back to life with those tender, loving strokes. Sion finally exploded in frustration, screaming back, just leave me alone already! But no matter how much raw physical strength he poured into his arms, the thick leather proved to be impossibly hard, refusing to yield to the mundane steel. He quickly recognized that if he continued utilizing standard methods, he would absolutely never finish the task. Closing his eyes, he took a deep breath and focused his mind. He understood with absolute clarity that he needed to actively channel his elemental power if he wanted his small knife to be of any practical use against a C-rank hide. He began to seamlessly channel his raw mana directly into the sharp edge of the blade, causing the cold metal to glow with a vibrant, humming energy until the monster's stubborn skin finally gave way, parting like soft butter beneath the reinforced edge. Once he had successfully harvested the premium leather, Sion sat down on the sand and began to meticulously carve a sharp, dorsal fin until he had thinned it, down to be as sharp and lethal as a metallic needle. He then carefully extracted the long, durable tendons directly from the monster's meat to utilize them as primitive, high-tensile thread. In this unforgiving, desolate world, if an individual desires clothes to protect their skin, they must manually fabricate them from scratch. After hours of continuous labor, Sion stared down at the messy results of his hard work, with his eyes as wide as dinner plates, whispered to himself, "This is..." He could scarcely believe the utter disaster resting right in front of him. Crayon, who was casually reclining nearby as if he were sunbathing on a luxury beach, offered absolutely zero mercy or comfort. It is an absolute unmitigated failure. You have successfully managed to transform a premium C-rank fish hide into a pile of useless garbage. Sion dropped directly onto his knees, completely surrounded by tattered, worthless scraps of ruined leather. The old man laughed uproariously at his miserable misfortune, but Sion fiercely refused to let the mockery break his spirit. Heh, I still have plenty of raw material left over. I'm going to attempt it once more. As the heavy darkness of the desert night blanketed the landscape, the young boy continued to relentlessly hammer away at his craft beneath a canopy of glittering stars, raw determination being the absolute only resource he had left to his name. Suddenly, a triumphant cry shattered the midnight silence. It actually worked. I'm finally finished, Sion shouted to the four winds, proudly donning his brand new creation. After a grueling sequence of 8 consecutive failed attempts, Sion was finally debuting his custom-made tunic with immense pride. Heh. This quality is so extraordinarily good that I could easily sell it for a fortune. Welcome to the exclusive Sion boutique. The boy suddenly wrapped his arms tightly around his new garments by pure, defensive instinct, glaring suspiciously at his mentor. No way, I don't want to, and I absolutely will not give it to you. I will not give you my tunic. He knew through bitter experience that the old man was always plotting something devious. Crayon merely sneered, reaching into his gear to pull out a massive, sloshing brown sack that looked incredibly viscous and vile. Stop spewing your idiotic stupidities and swallow this right now. Sion's stomach violently churned into knots from the sheer sight and foul odor of the mass. It was the highly concentrated gallbladder of the sand angler, an incredibly rare, potent natural medicine. Consume every single microscopic bit of it, and make absolutely sure not a single gram goes to waste, the old man commanded with a sadistic, twisted grin. Crayon stepped closer, his voice dropping into a menacing register. And make no mistake, if you choose not to eat it, you will simply die. This isn't a friendly suggestion, brat. It is an explicit death threat. He extended his arm, joking. Hurry up and take it already. My arm is about to fall off from holding this heavy garbage. Sion reluctantly accepted the disgusting mass, his face twisting into an expression of deep horror. The young boy swallowed hard, holding the repulsive object directly in front of his face while the unbearable, suffocating stench invaded his senses. Fine, damn it all! He cursed under his breath. If it truly was medicine, he had no choice. Sion took a massive, aggressive bite out of the mass, bracing his mind for the absolute worst taste imaginable, reasoning that it was still infinitely better than being beaten to death by his mentor. He stood there chewing, his face rapidly morphing into a state of profound confusion. Eh? What on earth is this? He had no idea what kind of horrific flavor profile to expect, but the substance felt remarkably like he was chewing on a soft, fluffy cloud. Despite consuming the massive portion, Sion didn't feel physically full at all, the texture being completely out of this world. Well, thanks to that amazing texture, I managed to finish it rapidly. Crayon suddenly interrupted his self-congratulations, his tone carrying an ominous weight that promised absolutely nothing good. "Hey, idiot," the old man muttered, calmly roasting a fresh skewer of meat over the campfire. "It is officially time for you to burn to death." Sion froze completely solid, his heart skipping a beat. "What the hell are you talking about now?" Before he could even demand an explanation, a brilliant, glowing mark of pure fire erupted directly upon his chest, and an apocalyptic wave of agony struck his entire nervous system simultaneously. His veins began to violently swell and protrude against his skin, turning a deep crimson, as he felt his actual blood supply, literally reaching a boiling point within his body. "What the absolute fuck? My entire body is burning alive!" The internal heat was entirely insupportable, feeling as though a river of molten, volcanic lava had been forcefully injected directly into his core. "My mana channels are completely spinning out of control. It hurts so damn much! It feels like a miniature sun is violently twisting inside my stomach." Sion collapsed heavily onto the hard sand, his body writhing in agonizing contortions as his frantic, blood-curdling screams shattered the absolute silence of the desert night. Crayon merely observed the entire torturous process with an unshakable, calm demeanor. "Hold on tight and endure it, you moron." While Sion continued to suffer through the excruciating baptism of fire, Crayon grew deeply philosophical, turning his gaze toward the dark waters of the oasis. "Everything in this world is exactly like this fragile place. Soon enough, it will completely disappear into the treacherous quicksand, vanishing entirely as though it had never existed in the first place. Yet, deep down beneath the surface, life stubbornly persists. Even in the harshest environments, new sand anglers will be born and return once more. The eternal cycle never stops." "Shut up already, you damn old man!" Sion screamed through gritted teeth, continuing to frantically roll around in the hot sand, hating his eccentric master with every single fiber of his mortal soul. "Stop getting so completely lost in your garbage sentimental feelings." Sion could only pathetically supplicate for his life, through consecutive walls of agonizing screams. The old man simply stared down at his writhing form for a quiet moment, as if casually verifying whether the boy was still actively breathing or on the verge of expiration, while the youth continued to hurl fierce insults toward the starry night. The desert ants. These monstrous insects were operating on a level of sheer, unmitigated malice. Sion immediately crouched low to the shifting terrain, his muscles coiling like high tensile springs as he prepared a desperate counterattack while a chaotic vortex of choking dust spun violently all around his perimeter. "Fine. If we are genuinely forced to fight this gauntlet, let's make it incredibly fast," he muttered through gritted teeth, a cold sweat breaking out across his neck. "If I end up late keeping pace, that ruthless old man will literally murder me without a second thought." With a definitive heavy stomp of his combat boot against the hot sand, the official countdown of the brutal confrontation commenced. For a single agonizing microsecond, the absolute fabric of time itself appeared to completely freeze in place. Then, unleashing a chorus of deafening, blood-curdling screeches that threatened to split the sky, the ravenous horde of giant ants launched, their massive bodies forward to tear their human prey limb from limb. This was the definitive make-or-break moment to thoroughly put his newly awakened reservoir of supernatural power to the test. Sion forced his mind into a state of maximum, razor-sharp concentration, and violently activated his sand manipulation ability, the surrounding grains beginning to hum with a lethal golden mana frequency. Far off in the safe distance, Crayon didn't bother offering a single word of genuine praise to congratulate the novice for being an obedient student. Suddenly, a spectacular, catastrophic explosion of compressed sand erupted from the ground, shooting straight toward the heavens like a geyser of solid earth. Crayon casually walked further away from the unfolding carnage, indifferently commenting to himself that violent storm days were arguably the absolute best conditions for combat, simply because there was premium, high-grade sand readily available in every single direction. Left completely isolated in the epicenter of the swarm, Sion screamed at the absolute top of his lungs, cursing the veteran as a dirty, heartless old bastard for callously abandoning him in the dirt just like that. Even as a gargantuan black-shelled ant materialized, like a silent nightmare right behind his blind spot, Sion simply continued to furiously complain, aloud, barking that Crayon possessed absolutely zero baseline sense of companionship or loyalty. Yet, mid-rant, the boy suddenly thought twice about his loud insults, an icy shiver traveling down his spine, as he nervously wondered if the eccentric old monster's inhuman senses had actively picked up on his disrespect. Just in case the old man was actively planning a violent retribution, Sion internally resolved that he was already perfectly prepared to drop to his knees and beg for forgiveness the moment they reunited. Refocusing his tactical awareness, he expanded his golden mana grid, ensuring his precise zone of elemental detection seamlessly covered a strict 10-meter radius all around his body. He refused to lower his guard for a single microsecond, his golden eyes scanning the dust as he anticipated the enemy's next lethal trajectory. Suddenly, an alarming instinct flared deep within his gut, screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with the battlefield. His sensory radar picked up an impossibly massive, synchronized tremor radiating. Directly beneath the soles of his boots, a subterranean presence so gargantuan it caused the hairs on the back of his neck to stand perfectly on end. In a terrifying explosion of earth, an infinite, staggering legion of giant ants began to violently sprout from the loose sand, systematically enveloping his entire physical position until there was absolutely no avenue of retreat left. Sion's mind fractured in pure disbelief, utterly incapable of comprehending how such a ridiculous, endlessly multiplying army could manifest in the span of a single fraction of a second. He frantically called out the old man's name again, fully realizing the borderline comedic, hopeless quantity of insectoid monsters he was currently being forced to handle entirely on his own. Yet, when he cast a panicked glance toward the horizon, he saw Crayon sitting comfortably atop a distant dune, casually observing the life or death struggle as if he were relaxing in the premium seats of a movie theater. Sion fiercely bit his tongue, a sudden surge of pride washing away his panic. He was absolutely not a helpless little child anymore, who needed to pathetically beg for assistance. Every single time a situation grew hazardous, he understood with absolute clarity that this horrific scenario was simply another one of his sadistic master's unyielding, practical survival missions. A wild, borderline maniacal smile stretched across his face as he steeled his resolve, deciding that whether he was facing 10 monsters or 10,000, these overgrown bugs would never succeed in dictating his fear. Sion unleashed a devastating flurry of close-quarters strikes, channeling his mana to project high-velocity raffigas of compressed sand to shatter the advancing carapaces. Suddenly, one of the massive warrior ants launched its entire weight directly over his head with blinding speed. Sion barely managed to execute a frantic, desperate dodge, feeling the razor-sharp pressure of the beast's colossal pinzas as they snapped shut a mere millimeter away from violently ripping his head from his shoulders. However, the sheer momentum of the following swarm successfully overwhelmed his footing, crashing into his torso with the force of a runaway freight train and flattening his body mercilessly into the hard ground as a sharp cry of pure agony escaped his lips. He bitterly spat blood into the dirt, furiously complaining that these mindless bastards possessed absolutely zero moral conscience or honor for systematically jumping him all at once instead of engaging in a proper, civilized one-on-one duel. He was completely and utterly surrounded. The sheer weight of the insectoid bodies, pressing down until there appeared to be absolutely no physical way out of the meat grinder, as suddenly, a localized explosion of raw, concentrated mana violently erupted from Sion's core, forcefully launching his body, flying upward, through the air away from the suffocating swarm. He quickly consolidated the surrounding terrain, constructing a towering, elevated pillar of solid stone beneath his feet to afford himself a single microsecond of breathing room to restore oxygen to his burning lungs. Looking down from his makeshift vantage point, the grim, unadulterated reality of his situation finally laid itself bare before his eyes. He was currently standing directly on top of a gargantuan, sprawling subterranean supernest. He rapidly planned to ascend even higher into the sky to properly analyze the macro structure of the swarm and locate a definitive weak point. But before he could execute the maneuver, a terrifying anomaly intercepted his trajectory mid-flight. A massive warrior ant performed a borderline miraculous leap from the ground, shattering all laws of biology to reach his exact altitude in the open air. Sion was struck completely mute with horror upon witnessing the undeniable fact that these heavily armored bastards could actively jump to impossible heights. The subsequent mid-air impact was brutally violent, the sheer kinetic force driving his body straight back down toward the earth like a falling meteor. Sion crashed into the ground with catastrophic velocity, throwing up a massive, blinding cloud of dust and debris that completely obscured the area. He violently coughed up a thick mouthful of crimson, blood from the sheer internal trauma of the impact, desperately gasping for air as he struggled to regain his equilibrium. He could barely manage to sustain himself on his hands and knees, his vision blurring as the relentless, chittering horde began to aggressively close the distance toward his prone form once again. With his face systematically covered in deep bruises, scrapes, and trickling blood, he slowly forced his head upward to look toward the horizon. Crayon stood far in the distance with his arms firmly crossed over his chest, his cold eyes completely unreadable as he silently waited to see if Sion would finally choose to surrender to the dark embrace of defeat or force his broken body to keep fighting. Sion bared his blood-stained teeth in a ferocious, deeply defiant smile, screaming across the desolate plains for the old bastard to sit his ass back down and carefully observe exactly how a real warrior survives this absolute living hell. Crayon's lips slowly curled into a subtle, sinister side smile. That exact, unyielding attitude was the precise psychological breakthrough he had been aggressively seeking to cultivate within his disciple. The veteran internally reflected that in a world that had been systematically converted into a barren, apocalyptic desert wasteland. A supernatural authority over sand like Seon's was nothing short of a divine blessing that any sane hunter would deeply envy. He knew for a fact that countless high-ranking awakened would gladly commit mass murder just to possess an elemental attribute with that specific level of environmental synergy. He quietly pondered how the modern populace completely failed to comprehend the true, bloody origin of this ruined world, the immense power of the awakened. Without understanding the trauma required to forge it, Crayon called out through the wind, asking the boy if he genuinely possessed the burning desire to survive this gauntlet and become fundamentally strong. Right now was the definitive, make-or-break moment for the novice to definitively prove to the universe whether he had the mettle to become a true, authenticated awakened hunter. As the surrounding desert structures literally began to crumble to pieces under the weight of the insectoid army, the hardened veteran sat down on a boulder, preparing to see if his student possessed the raw capability to endure until the final curtain. The sheer, destructive chaos unfolding before his eyes triggered a sudden wave of deep memory, reminding his ancient soul of the apocalyptic tragedy that had transpired exactly 100 years ago, the horrific day, a blinding, cataclysmic ray of pure light, systematically erased modern civilization in the span of a single, collective heartbeat. Massive skyscrapers had collapsed like fragile card houses, and an unquenchable, prehistoric fire had consumed the entirety of human achievement in a terrifying flash. It had been an absolute, inescapable hell on earth. Witnessing your precious loved ones, your friends, and your entire reality instantaneously vaporize into ash, right? Before your very eyes was a horrific trauma that permanently burned itself into the absolute marrow of a survivor's bones. That was the eternal, suffocating curse carried by those who managed to successfully survive the apocalypse, being permanently forced to carry those heavy, bloody memories until the day they finally stopped breathing. To a man like Crayon, basic survival was never defined by the simple act of pulling oxygen into your lungs. It meant actively and aggressively crossing the razor-thin boundary separating life and death. With every single step you took in this world, the old man let out another one of his signature terrifying smiles, knowing with absolute certainty the sheer magnitude of the horrors that still awaited the young boy. But Sion refused to be left behind in the dirt. He began to aggressively harness every single residual drop of his internal mana, his aura flaring to life right in the absolute center of the raging sandstorm. Locking his chaotic golden eyes onto the advancing enemy, he unleashed a wild, maniacal laugh, darkly warning the chittering bugs that they were all completely and utterly finished. A massive, suffocating wave of giant ants rushed toward his position like a black tidal wave, but the young warrior had already rapidly engineered a lethal plan. He concentrated his raw mana channels to their absolute peak, compressing the surrounding sand particles into a hyper-dense, high-pressure elemental projectile. He launched the specialized attack forward with a catastrophic, destructive force that effortlessly pulverized absolutely everything existing in its operational trajectory. The vanguard of the ant army didn't even possess the baseline reaction time required to register the threat. Before the supersonic velocity of the sand, missiles systematically tore through their carapaces. Sion unleashed the absolute totality of his awakened power, effectively multiplying the raw kinetic force of his elemental attacks tenfold. He laughed like a complete psychopath through the dust, screaming at the top of his lungs that this was officially the definitive end of the road for every single one of them. The ensuing kinetic shockwave violently displaced metric tons of desert sand in every direction, and for a brief, glorious microsecond, Sion felt entirely invincible. Far in the distance, Crayon quietly observed the sudden outburst of power, shaking his head as he silently thought that the naive brat was getting entirely too ahead of himself far too early in the game. Suddenly, Sion's movements halted in a dead stop. An icy, paralyzing sensation flooded his nervous system, whispering that something was profoundly wrong. Although the immediate battlefield was completely littered with deep craters and shattered insect carapaces, it was the absolute, suffocating silence of the area that deeply disquieted his senses. He tightly clenched his trembling fist, still riding the immense high of his massive power surge, foolishly believing that he already had the total victory securely packed away in his bag. He turned his head to loudly shout for the old man to watch exactly how he annihilated the remaining forces. But before the words could fully leave his mouth, a sudden heavy blow struck him squarely from behind. He froze completely solid, his blood running entirely cold as the horrifying realization set in that a colossal warrior ant had somehow materialized directly behind his blind spot without his expanded detection grid registering a single shred of its movement. The monster was absolutely gargantuan, yet it emitted not a single microscopic trace of a presence or mana signature. Sion was instantly in serious life-threatening trouble. Before he could even attempt to pivot his torso, one of the ant's massive, razor-sharp legs forcefully impaled his shoulder, pinning his physical body directly into the hard ground like a broken specimen. The moment the foreign entity entered his flesh, he felt his internal mana channels violently fracturing and shutting down, causing him to instantly understand the enemy's lethal strategy. They had successfully injected a highly specialized neurotoxin, specifically engineered to completely block his energy pathways. Sion let out a roar of pure, unadulterated rage and agonizing pain as the monstrous creature began to callously drag his paralyzed body across the dirt as if he were nothing more than a pile of discarded garbage. Utterly incapable of mobilizing a single shred of elemental defense, Sion was systematically swallowed up by the shifting sand, completely vanishing from the surface of the desert world. He slowly cracked a single eye open with immense physical difficulty, finding his conscious mind waking up within a deeply dark, suffocatingly humid subterranean cavern. It took his dazed senses a few seconds to fully process the horror of his current coordinates. He had been dragged down and trapped within the absolute deepest, most secure chamber of the ant supernest. He desperately attempted to mobilize his limbs, but he discovered he was completely surrounded by a shifting sea of ravenous, translucent larvas that were staring at his bleeding body as if he were the main course of a royal banquet. The monstrous maggot-like creatures began to aggressively close the distance toward his position, unleashing an insupportable, rhythmic chittering sound that vibrated violently against his eardrums as they prepared to feed. Without warning, one of the massive larvae clamped its dripping mandibles directly onto his forearm, and the resulting paralyzing agony was so immense that his vocal cords completely seized, leaving him utterly incapable of even screaming. He could actively feel the fluid mandibles of the monster systematically masticando through his muscle tissue, transforming his reality into an inescapable living nightmare. Pure, suffocating panic rapidly conquered his mind as the absolute realization settled in that he was explicitly about to be eaten alive while entirely incapable of deploying a single defensive reaction. With his entire face covered in fresh blood and dirt, he blankly stared up at the cavern ceiling, bitterly questioning if this humiliating, disgusting hole was truly destined to be the absolute, final destination of his grand journey. He locked his fading gaze directly onto the ravenous larva resting on top of his chest, actively feeling the very essence of his life force, systematically escaping his physical body. The subterranean nursery was completely filled to the brim with thousands of these giant worms, every single one of them shifting and waiting their turn to tear off a fresh piece of his flesh. Yet despite the total suffocating paralysis freezing his nervous system, Sion desperately forced every single shred of his remaining willpower down into his right hand, attempting to tightly clench his fist with the microscopic amount of strength he had left to his name. High up on the surrounding stone tunnels, fully matured adult warrior ants kept a strict, unyielding vigil, ensuring their pinned prey possessed absolutely zero avenues of physical escape. Sion let out a bitter, hollow laugh within his mind. He could scarcely believe his entire life was actively terminating inside a foul, subterranean hole. But a sudden, burning wave of pure, unadulterated hatred rapidly consumed his despair. He fiercely refused to die a pathetic death like this, even if his entire life flashed before his eyes in these final seconds. He absolutely denied the concept of surrender. Sion unleashed a desperate, roaring scream of pure fury directly into the faces of the advancing monsters, explicitly refusing to become their baseline, sustenance without dragging them down to hell with him. Suddenly, a catastrophic, apocalyptic explosion of pure dark energy violently shook the foundational bedrock of the entire supernest, the immense, kinetic shockwave forcefully launching the surrounding larvae far away from his body. The adult warrior ants froze completely solid for a single second, their primitive minds deeply confused by the sudden, inexplicable transformation occurring within their prey. But their apex predator instincts rapidly overrode their hesitation, forcing them to launch their massive bodies forward once again, with their dripping mandibles open for the kill. Boom! Another monumentally massive explosion of concentrated mana violently rattled the subterranean cavern. Sion emerged majestically from the debris, his entire physical body completely enveloped in a terrifying, radiating shroud of dark energy that he had never possessed prior to this moment. Dozens of hyperdense sand projectiles floated effortlessly around his perimeter like an orbital defense system. He looked down at his trembling hands in absolute, unadulterated incredulity. The residual neurotoxin had been completely purged from his system, and he could actively feel his raw mana and physical energy flowing through his. Looking at his hands in pure disbelief, he realized the poison had completely vanished, replaced by mana and power flowing through his veins like never before. He knew he had leveled up, wondering if this was what people called an evolution, given that his body felt incredibly light yet immensely powerful. His raw strength and mana reserves were now in an entirely different league, compared to when he was a mere F-rank hunter, but he knew the battle was far from over. With eyes gleaming with a renewed sense of determination, he looked ahead to see a colossal ant, far larger than any of the previous ones, and realized with a grim jolt that his earlier attacks hadn't left so much as a single scratch on it. Suddenly, the beast lunged at him, tearing through solid rock as if it were nothing but thin paper. Sion barely managed to dodge the strike, utterly astounded by the creature's monstrous strength. Shattering bedrock like sand was simply unnatural. Yet the beast kept charging forward, completely unbothered by any counterattacks. Sion anxiously wondered how powerful this monster could truly be. It was entirely out of control, and its impenetrable shell remained flawlessly intact. A cold sweat broke out across Sion's body as he realized he could never win a battle of brute force against a titan like this. If he wanted to make it out alive, he had to use his head. Knowing that no amount of direct striking would shatter that virtually indestructible armor, he stared intently at the beast's legs, searching for an alternative solution. If he couldn't break or pierce the shell, he would just have to tear it off entirely. With a clear target in mind, he charged back into the fray, resulting in a brutal clash of opposing energies. Sion concentrated his entire power into a single localized point, generating an unbearable pressure that made the very air vibrate. The giant ant let out a screech of pure agony as Sion unleashed his technique. The high-frequency vibrations were violently tearing its internal organs apart. However, Sion was screaming in pain too, as the strain of maintaining the technique pushed his body to its absolute limits. Refusing to let go, even as he felt his own brain was about to explode from the frequencies, he realized this was a suicidal move. He bitterly cursed old Crayon for hiding such a dangerous technique from him until the final moment, but there was no turning back now. The energy spun into a destructive vortex, trapping the queen ant in the center of the chaos. It was all or nothing. With bloodshot eyes, Sion roared at the beast, declaring they would see who died first. He no longer cared if he went down with it. The final explosion of energy was so immensely potent that it distorted reality itself around them. Having reached his absolute limit, Sion gave one last desperate cry and unleashed every ounce of his remaining power, sending out a final shockwave that silenced the entire anthill. Suddenly, everything went pitch black. Sion floated in a void of nothingness, feeling his body completely shut down after such an immense expenditure of energy. He collapsed heavily onto the ground, exhausted, covered in blood, with a fading breath and eyes he could barely keep. But he cursed his own physical weakness, feeling his consciousness slip away and believing that this time, he was truly finished. It felt pathetic to lie helplessly in the dirt, unable to move a single muscle, waiting to die in this dark hole. But out of nowhere, a firm and familiar hand lifted him from the ground. It was Creon, sporting his usual smug smile, calling Sion a weakling for falling asleep there and joking that his face would freeze that way. If he took a nap in a place like this, Sion could barely form words. But he managed to murmur an insult back at the old man, refusing to lose his sharp edge even on the brink of death. Creon burst into laughter, calling him an insolent brat but conceding that he wasn't completely useless after what he had just pulled off. Looking over at the corpse of the C-rank wolf queen ant, Creon explained that the monster had been vastly stronger than Sion, but he gave the boy credit for refusing to back down even in the face of death. As far as the old man was concerned, Sion had earned the right to live. Sion managed a tiny smile, entirely unaware of what was being said since his eardrums had ruptured from the blast, leaving him completely deaf. He was utterly broken, but he had survived. Noticing that the boy had blown out his own eardrums, Creon mocked him playfully, though he didn't seem genuinely worried as he began, dragging Sion along the ground, without a shred of gentleness. Confused and racked with pain, Sion asked where they were going in such a rush, his vision blurring, as the old man hoisted him up and shook him like a sack of potatoes. Finally, they arrived at a deeper, collapsed section of the anthill. Deep within the collapsed ruins of the anthill, the darkest, most profound chamber lay in absolute ruin. Amidst the scattered debris and crushed earth, a faint, mysterious light pulsed with an eerie brilliance. Sion could only stand there, his gaze locked onto the glowing orb, entirely unable to comprehend the strange object that had been unearthed by the destruction. His face was a perfect portrait of sheer confusion. Turning to his mentor, he questioned what the bizarre artifact could possibly be. Creon, flashing his usual sarcastic smirk, prepared a response that he knew his pupil would absolutely detest. With a malicious grin, the old man explained that the glowing sphere was actually a queen ant's egg. He casually added that Sion was going to eat it like medicine, playfully tossing in a final joke that it even tasted like strawberry. Sion stood frozen, torn between laughing at the absurdity or crying in despair. His eyes drifted down to the very word medicine, carved into the stone floor beneath his feet. Remaining entirely unconvinced, the orb continued to shimmer intensely before him, making him wonder if a thing like that could even be chewed. Hesitant, Sion asked the old man if this was going to hurt as badly as the last thing he had been forced to consume. Creon bluntly retorted that he would probably die if he ate it, but Sion had already tuned him out. Figuring that since his master called it medicine, it had to be done, Sion threw caution to the wind, popped the orb into his mouth, and swallowed it whole in a single thoughtless gulp. To his absolute astonishment, it tasted incredibly delicious. For a fleeting second, a wave of relief and happiness washed over Sion, but his joy was brutally short-lived. A sudden violent tearing sensation erupted deep within his core, as if something vital was shattering inside him. Without warning, crimson thorns burst forth, ripping through his skin from the inside, out in an agony so infernal it defied description. This agonizing phenomenon was known as wanghang, a devastating reaction where a person's intestines literally twist and coil all the way up to their throat. As it turned out, the queen ant's egg was a lethal toxin designed to force a violent, total body purge. The agonizing thorns tore mercilessly through his internal organs, piercing right through his flesh and shredding his clothes. Collapsing to the floor, Sion coughed up torrents of blood, using the absolute last of his strength to scream at the old man, demanding to know what kind of hellish poison he had just been fed. Creon, completely unfazed, merely cleaned out his ear with a pinky finger, nonchalantly telling the boy that he had better start getting used to the harsh realities of the real world. Sion gasped desperately for air, but the overwhelming agony paralyzed his thoughts. He began coughing up a thick, black sludge of blood as even more thorns violently erupted across his back, staring at his hands, which were now drenched in the dark, foul liquid. He couldn't believe this nightmare was happening to him. He felt like an absolute fool. For a brief moment, he had foolishly believed he could actually trust someone, and he bitterly cursed his own naive innocence for putting faith in the old man. Sion finally collapsed into the dark, cold shadows of the cave pooling in his own blood. Creon could not have cared less about his disciple's agonizing suffering. Turning his back on the dying boy, the old man strode over to the corpse of the giant ant and, with a swift crushing blow, shattered the monster's head to see what lay inside. He began rummaging through the viscous, slimy remains of the dead queen ant until his fingers wrapped around a brilliant, glowing stone. Pulling it free, he held up a mana crystal of the absolute highest quality. Creon's eyes lit up with unbridled greed. This singular crystal was a jackpot, far more valuable than anything found in the standard mines. Deciding that since he was already here, he might as well plunder everything of use, Creon gathered his loot, before finally turning around to glance at the thorn-covered body, sprawled across the cave floor. He muttered a cold observation about his student, his gaze entirely icy and calculating. Looking down at the motionless boy, he coldly delivered his final verdict. If he is weak, he dies, for that is simply his destiny. The old man turned and began to walk away, fully prepared to leave the boy behind to rot in the dark, muttering to himself that they didn't have any time to waste. Suddenly, Sion's eyes snapped wide open. He was still alive, and a torrential, burning rage consumed his entire being. Noticing the sudden shift, Creon let out a mocking laugh, amused that the brat had actually woken up. Boom! A massive, violent explosion of sand violently shook the entire cavern. Creon shielded himself from the thick, blinding dust storm, scoffing at the disrespectful brat for causing such an outrageous scene. However, the old man's smirk quickly faded into a grim scowl when he realized that Sion's murderous intent was terrifyingly real. Sion rose to his feet, completely enveloped in a churning vortex of sand that rapidly shaped into a cluster of lethal, razor-sharp spears. Creon could hardly believe the boy was taking this so seriously as the brutal projectiles launched forward with terrifying velocity, flying straight at him. Sion unleashed a desperate, agonizing scream, demanding to know why his master had tried to murder him as he unleashed the full, untamed torrent of his newly awakened power. The impact was colossal. The cavern trembled violently as Sion discharged his accumulated fury, vowing that he would never forgive the old man. His eyes blazed with a blinding, pure white light as he summoned massive pillars of rock and sand, slamming them forward with a force that threatened to bring the entire cave down around them. The brutal collision kicked up a monumental cloud of dust, completely obscuring the battlefield. Sion had thrown every single drop of his energy into that desperate all-out assault. Exhausted and completely spent, he stood panting heavily, his face drenched in sweat. His eyes locked onto the dust cloud to see the results. Creon merely let out a bored, heavy sigh, calmly stepping through the debris completely uninjured, and asked what on earth the boy was trying to accomplish. Sion froze in absolute horror at the sight of his completely unscathed master. Creon casually explained that while the queen ant's egg contained potent elements that temporarily warped a person's judgment, Sion had severely crossed the line with that tantrum. Sion's mind reeled in disbelief. His most devastating, full-power attack hadn't managed to leave so much as a single scratch on the detestable old man. Creon looked down at him as if he were an utter freak, mentioning that he could easily kill him with a simple flick to the forehead if he truly wished to. Lowering his head, Sion swallowed the bitter pill of humiliation, fully aware that it was an absolute miracle he was even alive. The master then clarified the true purpose of the ordeal. The lethal poison had actually served to violently purge every single hidden impurity lurking within his body. Creon explained that now that his internal pathways were completely clean, his mana could flood those vacant spaces without a single shred of resistance. True enough, Sion could feel the staggering difference. His mana reserves had multiplied several times over. coursing through his veins with the fierce, crackling intensity of pure electricity. Even so, he couldn't entirely shake off the deep resentment he felt for the old man's incredibly brutal methods. In a sudden dramatic shift of attitude, Sion desperately threw his arms around Creon, weeping and begging for forgiveness for ever doubting his master's intentions. Disgusted by the sudden display of affection, Creon violently shoved him away, snapping that he absolutely detested men clinging to him. Sion stubbornly kept up his dramatic act, weeping loudly until the old man barked at him to shut up and let go, telling him he was acting like a pathetic little child. Inwardly, however, Creon secretly admitted to himself that it had been an incredibly reckless gamble, and the boy genuinely could have died. For his part, Sion secretly hoped this theatrical display of weakness would trick the old man into lowering his guard so he wouldn't spring anymore, life-threatening surprises on him. But Creon knew the harsh truth. If Sion didn't grow powerful at an explosive rate, he would never survive in this merciless world. Tightening his fist, and without a single word of warning, the old man hoisted Sion up, throwing him over his arm like a heavy sack of laundry. Sion fiercely protested, yelling about why he had to be carried in such a ridiculous manner yet again. Creon merely flashed a predatory, dangerous grin, stating that there was no time to lose and they needed to move immediately. With that, Creon prepared to blast out of the subterranean depths at a terrifying velocity. The sheer, absurd speed of their movement made Sion feel as though he was on the verge of fainting, silently praying for the nightmare ride to finally end. Out on the surface, unsuspecting desert scorpions minded their own business, completely oblivious to the chaos brewing below, when a massive explosion of sand suddenly erupted as Creon burst triumphantly out of the underground tunnels. The old man roared with laughter, thoroughly enjoying the exhilarating speed, while Sion screamed over the rushing wind, begging him to travel like a normal human being for once in his life. Creon openly mocked him in response, pointing out that the brat had just slept for 4 consecutive days, straight following his intense purification process. The boy was utterly stunned by the revelation. Creon teased him further, joking that if he remained this pathetic and weak, he would never manage to find a woman willing to marry him. Suddenly, Sion's attention was grabbed by something moving in the distance. He began to stammer in sheer confusion, his eyes widening in absolute awe as his brain slowly registered the monumental scale of the entity looming on the horizon. He could scarcely believe his eyes. It was an archelon, a creature so impossibly colossal that it looked like a literal mountain, slowly walking across the desert wasteland. Even from miles away, its sheer size was staggering, leaving Sion to wonder how a monster of such mythical proportions could possibly exist. Creon simply watched his reaction with a knowing smirk, explaining that the beast was a B-rank mobile fortress, though its defensive capabilities far surpassed most A-rank threats. He added that humans had heavily modified its massive shell, domesticating the Titan to serve as a giant roaming transport vessel. Sion's jaw remained dropped. He couldn't comprehend how anyone could ever master and ride a nightmare beast of that scale. Creon told him to keep his eyes wide open so he could finally grasp just how vast and grand the world truly was, emphasizing that there were extraordinary humans out there capable of taming even the fiercest anomalies. Sion had never felt so utterly microscopic. The colossal turtle emitted a deep, rumbling vibration that shook the earth as it plodded heavily across the dunes, carrying an entire settlement on its back. With a magnificent, logic-defying leap, Creon vaulted through the air and landed squarely at the base of the colossal creature. They touched down heavily upon the sand, coming face to face with a figure who seemed to be expecting their arrival. Their grand journey was only just beginning. A familiar voice suddenly echoed across the desert wind. Easily recognizing Creon despite the years and distance, Sion tensed up, startled by the stranger's formidable presence. But the old man sharply ordered him to stay still. Through a gleaming silver monocle, a piercing, perceptive eye locked onto them. The voice, heavy with age and deep nostalgia, warmly remarked on how much time had passed since they last crossed paths. Standing tall before them was Dioden, an imposing elder with an endlessly long white beard, whose mere presence commanded absolute authority and immediate respect in the heart of the inhospitable desert. Creon looked at the man who had just arrived and let out a grin before saying, "Haven't seen you in a while. Looks like you've lost even more teeth." After hearing that, Pavilsa gave him an annoyed look and replied, "Good grief, you're the one who's abnormal. You're over 100 years old, yet you're still so energetic." Creon laughed loudly before continuing, "Anyway, what brings you here? This isn't exactly your territory." Hearing that question, Pavilsa calmly answered, "Well, the scavengers are infesting the place." The moment Creon heard that, he immediately mocked him. "Running away from mere scavengers? You've clearly grown old for nothing." Pavilsa clicked his tongue and responded, "It's called being wise, unlike a brute like you." As Sion listened to the two old monsters arguing back and forth so casually, he could not help but think to himself, "Wait, isn't it normal to get weaker with age? How are these grandpas still this ridiculously strong?" Pavilsa eventually looked at Creon and said, "Forget it. There's no point talking to you. At the same time, the giant turtle monster slowly moved forward, its enormous body shaking the surroundings with every step. The overwhelming sight made Sion stare in disbelief as he muttered, "Whoa, that's insane." Pavilsa then looked toward them and simply said, "Let's go." Sion immediately became nervous after hearing that. Surrounded by terrifying monsters and absurdly powerful old men, he quietly lowered his head and thought, "I'd better stay quiet here." Just then, Pavilsa suddenly stopped walking and looked directly at Sion. "That's a face I haven't seen before. Is he your subordinate?" Without hesitation, Crayon grabbed Sion and lifted him up just like before, as if he weighed absolutely nothing. "Well, I decided to do my part for the environment and picked up a bit of trash." Pavilsa stared at him for a moment before mockingly replying, "To think a man like you would actually bring someone along. The world must be coming to an end." Soon after, Sion followed them onto the massive turtle's back. The moment he looked around properly, his eyes widened in complete shock. The place built on top of the gigantic creature looked like an entire hidden settlement. Countless structures, pathways, and people could be seen living there as if it were a moving fortress. Completely stunned, Sion looked around and asked, What kind of place is this?" Crayon casually answered, "It's the Mort clan." Sion blinked in confusion before asking, "A clan? You mean they're all blood-related?" "Yeah," Crayon replied. "They're all Pavilsa's direct descendants. A bunch of fools who think they are the chosen ones. In reality, they're useless without the Archelon." Before he could continue any further, Pavilsa immediately interrupted him with an irritated expression. "What do you know about our clan to be running your mouth like that?" Crayon smirked fearlessly and answered, "I know plenty. They're just a bunch of parasites who'll be abandoned by the Archelon once you kick the bucket." The atmosphere instantly became tense, but before things could escalate any further, Pavilsa raised his hand and stopped the argument. "Let's save that conversation for later." After entering a large room deep inside the settlement, everyone gathered around a massive table placed at the center. The atmosphere there felt heavy and serious compared to before. Pavilsa then looked toward Crayon and calmly said, "Fine, shall we take a look at the goods first?" Without saying another word, Crayon raised one of his hands and opened the portal in the air itself. A moment later, enormous amounts of treasure, monster parts, weapons, and countless strange items began pouring out from inside it one after another. The sight was so overwhelming that Sion instinctively turned around in shock and shouted, "Holy crap! What is all this? Just how many things did you kill?" After hearing Sion's reaction, Crayon slowly turned toward him with a grin that felt more terrifying than amusing. "You'll be joining the pile soon enough," Sion stared at the enormous pile of treasures and strange materials spilling out from Crayon's subspace portal. Unable to contain his curiosity any longer, after hesitating for a moment, he finally looked toward the old man and asked, "Anyway, Grandpa, I've been wondering, are you a magic type? Where are you even pulling all this stuff from?" Crayon immediately looked at him with disbelief before replying, "You don't even know about subspace?" He let out an irritated sigh and shook his head in disappointment. "Ugh, I can't believe I'm traveling with such an idiot." Sion instantly became annoyed after hearing that and shouted back, "Would it kill you to just explain it to me?" The moment Crayon heard Sion raising his voice at him, his expression turned sharp. He slowly looked down at the boy and growled, "Look at this punk. You dare talk back to me?" Meanwhile, on the other side of the room, Pavilsa completely ignored their argument and continued, carefully inspecting the massive collection of items spread across the table. After examining several monster materials and weapons, he finally nodded in approval. "Impressive as always," he said calmly. "Every single piece is top quality, flawless." Crayon smirked slightly after hearing the praise, but immediately replied, "Cut the flattery. How much can you give me?" Pavilsa stroked his chin for a moment before answering, "Shall I pay you in mana stones?" A brief silence followed before he casually added, "It was a joke. You really have no sense of humor. Besides, you don't have much use for mana stones anyway." He then folded his arms and looked directly at Crayon. "So what do you want?" Without even hesitating, Crayon immediately answered, "A breastplate made from the remains of wolf ant queens, and a subspace tool as well." The moment Pavilsa heard those requests, he narrowed his eyes slightly in confusion. "What use do you have for a breastplate? And you already possess plenty of subspace storage." At first, Crayon did not seem interested in explaining himself. However, after a brief pause, he suddenly replied in a calmer tone than usual, "It's not for me." Right after saying that, he suddenly grabbed Sion by the collar and lifted him into the air like a piece of luggage before adding, "It's for this idiot." Pavilsa quietly stared at Sion for a moment. Deep inside, he could not hide his surprise. To think the great Crayon would actually care about someone else. This kid must be pretty useful to him. A moment later, Pavilsa suddenly raised his voice and called out loudly, "Kaylee!" Sion instinctively turned toward the doorway, curious about who was coming. Before long, a young girl entered the room and respectfully asked, "Did you call for me, grandfather?" The moment Sion saw her, he froze for a second. She was unbelievably beautiful. Her appearance carried an elegant and mysterious charm that completely stood out from everyone else in the clan. Even Sion unconsciously found himself staring. Pavilsa then looked toward her and asked, "Do you still have that subspace bracelet you made before?" Kaylee nodded slightly before replying, "I don't have a bracelet, but I do have a gauntlet. The enchantment turned out so well that I've been keeping it safe." The moment she said that, Pavilsa immediately answered, "That gauntlet. Give it to the kid." Kaylee's eyes widened instantly. "But it's so precious." Before she could finish speaking, Crayon suddenly interrupted her with visible surprise in his voice. "So that little girl became an enchanter?" Crayon's appearance alone was enough to make Kaylee visibly nervous. Trying to keep her composure, she greeted him cautiously. "Hello there. You're still as energetic as ever." The moment he heard that, Crayon burst out loudly, as if he had been waiting for the opportunity to boast. Enchanters are rare even in Neo Soul. As expected of Pavilsa's granddaughter, you've gained quite a useful skill. Kaylee gave a small nod and replied, "Yes, I suppose so." Before their conversation could continue any further, Pavilsa abruptly interrupted them. "You must be uncomfortable, so hurry and get out. And tell Noel to craft a breastplate." Kaylee immediately accepted the order. "Understood." Then she turned towards Sion and waved him over. "Hey, you, follow me. I'll give you that gauntlet." "Yes, ma'am." "I'm coming," Sion answered obediently. As the two of them left, the two old men silently watched them walk away. Once they were outside and far enough from the workshop, Kaylee suddenly turned towards Sion with a serious expression. "What exactly is your relationship with that monster?" Sion blinked in confusion. "Monster? Oh, you mean that old man? We just met by chance and now I'm basically being dragged around by him." The moment those words left his mouth, Kaylee practically exploded. "What, by chance? And he's dragging you around while you're still alive? That monster's doing that?" Sion stared at her exaggerated reaction and couldn't help thinking to himself, "This woman, I can see it. She probably has the same impression of him as everyone else." At that moment, an old memory flashed through Kaylee's mind. Back when she was much younger, she had once seen Crayon laughing wildly while tearing apart magical beasts with his bare hands. With blood splattered everywhere, he had shouted cheerfully, "As I thought. Magic beasts taste best when you rip them apart with your bare hands." The memory alone was enough to make Kaylee cough awkwardly, before quickly changing the subject. "Well, anyway, you'd better be careful." She pointed back toward the workshop behind them. "Because he's a monster in human skin." Not wanting to continue that topic, Seon looked around and asked about the place they had arrived at. "My workshop," Kaylee replied proudly. "Try not to be too shocked. You've probably never seen anything like this in your life." The moment Seon stepped inside, his eyes widened in amazement. The entire workshop was overflowing with countless strange devices, weapons, armor pieces, and magical creations. Every corner was packed with extraordinary objects that looked far beyond anything he had ever seen before. "Are all of these items?" he asked in disbelief. Kaylee's face immediately lit up with excitement. "That's right. Every single one is an item I've worked on. Aside from dungeon drops, these are absolute masterpieces." She rushed over to one of the creations and proudly showed it off. "And look, do you see the harmony between this armored starfish frame and the adamantium? It has subspace storage and even a restoration function. It's a masterpiece among masterpieces." She looked completely fascinated by her own invention, speaking with the enthusiasm of a proud artist showing off their greatest work. Seon smiled as he examined the item more closely. "Restoration. Does that mean it can repair itself?" "Exactly," Kaylee answered immediately. "It even has a fire attribute attached. Depending on what fire-attributed item you equip together with this, you'll become an unimaginable monster." Hearing such an explanation, Seon couldn't help feeling hesitant. "Is it really okay for me to take something like this?" "Well, grandfather told me to give it to you, so..." Kaylee replied reluctantly. "Besides, you can only put something inside here once. You can't take it out again, so keep that in mind." Seon nodded seriously. "I'll remember. I'll accept it with great..." Before he could even finish speaking, he reached out to take the item. At the exact same moment, Kaylee grabbed it as well. Neither of them let go. The two instantly began pulling the item, back and forth like children fighting over a treasured toy. Kaylee's expression became desperate as she stubbornly refused to release it. "I can't!" "I won't. I'm not giving my precious child to a nobody like you." Seon tightened his grip and pulled back just as hard. "What do you want me to do?" "Sorry, but this is mine now!" The two continued their ridiculous tug of war, each refusing to surrender the item. Seon gritted his teeth and declared, "The child you raised with such care is now..." And the struggle over the precious masterpiece continued. Just as Seon and Kaylee were still struggling over the precious item, the entire area suddenly began to tremble violently. The massive turtle-like creature beneath them shook, and the surroundings rumbled as though something enormous was approaching. Startled by the sudden vibrations, Seon quickly turned toward Kaylee and asked, "What in the world is happening?" Kaylee immediately recognized the source of the disturbance and replied, with a grim expression, "The Archelon's cry." "The Archelon's cry?" Seon repeated in confusion. "Who are they?" However, before she could properly answer, It was obvious that her mood had already turned sour. She looked furious, as though she had encountered a problem she absolutely hated dealing with. At the same time, Pavilsa and Crayon also felt the powerful tremors. Pavilsa's expression darkened the moment he sensed what was happening. Clicking his tongue in annoyance, he muttered, "Persistent bastards." The scene then shifted outside, where a large group of horsemen could be seen rapidly advancing across the land. Dust clouds rose behind them as they charged forward without slowing down. These people were known as the Scavengers, a dangerous and infamous group feared throughout the region. Watching their approach, Kaylee explained, "They're a notorious group that's been expanding rapidly lately." Seon looked toward the approaching riders and asked, "Who exactly are they?" "The Black Shark Pirates," Kaylee answered immediately. "Their captain is a D-rank awakened crazy bastard, and every one of his top officers is an awakened scavenger. They don't just loot people." Her expression became even colder as she continued. "They're psychos who kill people without a second thought." The more she spoke about them, the angrier she seemed to become. Moving quickly through the facility, she eventually stopped in front of a large door while Sion hurried after her. "What?" Sion asked in disbelief. "Even though he's only D-rank?" Ignoring his surprise, Kaylee suddenly shouted toward the room beyond the door. "Grandfather! They've arrived!" Pavilsa's calm voice immediately answered from inside. "I already know." Kaylee quickly continued. "Should we move Archelon?" After considering it for only a moment, Pavilsa shook his head. "They'd catch up to us in no time. Now is the time to fight back." "Understood," Kaylee replied without hesitation. "I'll gather the combatants immediate—" Before she could finish, Crayon interrupted while remaining comfortably seated in his chair. "Not you guys. We'll handle this." His words instantly left Kaylee stunned. "What?" Then Crayon pointed directly at Sion and loudly shouted, "Hey, you punk! You're taking charge of this one." Sion froze. "What?" "Yeah, kid," Crayon roared. "You took the treasure, so are you just not gonna do anything?" "You have to pay them back!" Sion's eyes widened in disbelief. "But how am I supposed to beat a D-rank?" Crayon merely grinned. "So what, are you scared?" Those simple words hit Sion harder than he expected. For a moment, he couldn't come up with any response at all. It was such an obvious provocation, yet somehow it worked perfectly. A short while later, Sion found himself being thrown down from the giant turtle and sent toward the battlefield, whether he liked it or not. After landing, he could only stare ahead while silently cursing himself. "I can't believe I fell for such a cheap provocation." Then another thought entered his mind. "Just stay back if you're scared, then." The words echoed in his head as he clenched his fists. He's definitely experienced. That old man is incredibly crafty. Crayon had known exactly which buttons to press. Sion took a deep breath and forced himself to calm down. "Calm down, I don't have time for this." Then he released his power. Sion slowly closed his eyes and took a deep breath. As he concentrated, the sand spread across the surrounding area began to respond to his will, shifting and moving under his control. Without opening his eyes, he calmly muttered, "They'll be here in about 5 minutes. I need to figure out a way to beat an awakened who's higher rank than me." He then raised one of his hands into the air, and the markings on his glove became visible as streams of sand continued to swirl around him. Not far away, Pavilsa glanced toward Crayon and asked with a concerned expression, "Is this really okay?" Crayon looked at her and replied, "About what?" Pavilsa pointed toward Sion and said, "I'm asking if it's okay to leave that kid alone." "Didn't you say he's only E-rank?" Crayon's response came without hesitation. "If he loses, he dies. That's it." Hearing that, Pavilsa let out a sigh and stared at Sion from a distance. "You're as extreme as ever." Deep inside, she couldn't help but worry. Even a tiger cub could be bitten to death by a dog while it was still young. However, if that young cub managed to survive and bare its fangs, it could one day become a terrifying predator. Looking down at Sion, she suddenly shouted, "Hey, kid! Just remember one thing." However, the story never revealed exactly what she told him. Meanwhile, on the other side of the desert, a group of riders finally caught sight of their targets. One of the men rode up to the front and excitedly reported, "Finally caught up to them, Captain Gawain." "Should I tell the others to pick out the useful ones to sell?" Gawain looked ahead with a cruel grin spreading across his face. "Cut off all their limbs and throw them to the Archelons as feed. Let's carve it into their memories that we are the Black Shark Pirates. It's time for a massacre." Filled with confidence, the pirates urged their horses forward. However, before they could travel much farther, something happened that none of them had expected. Their horses suddenly came to a complete stop. The next moment, the sand beneath them began to collapse. In an instant, both riders and horses were dragged downward as if the desert itself had come alive. Gawain's eyes widened in shock as he shouted, "What is this? The sand is splitting! The sand is moving!" At that moment, a young woman quickly rushed up behind him and asked, "Captain, are you all right?" Gawain immediately turned toward her. "Klein, did these bastards set a trap?" Klein quickly shook her head. "No, there were definitely no traps. Maybe one of them is—" But before she could finish her sentence, a hand suddenly shot out from behind and grabbed her. It was Sion. The young awakened had appeared without anyone noticing. Before anyone could react, the sand surrounding him surged violently under his command. In a single motion, he unleashed his ability. The attack was swift, brutal, and merciless. Klang didn't even have time to scream. In one powerful burst, Sion crushed and killed her instantly. For a brief moment, the entire battlefield fell silent. Then Gawain saw the lifeless body of his subordinate. The realization hit him immediately. Rage exploded inside him, his face twisted with fury, his eyes burning with murderous intent as he glared directly at Sion. The calm confidence he had carried moments earlier vanished completely, replaced by pure hatred. The pirate captain's killing intent surged across the desert as he stared at the young man, who had just slaughtered one of his crew right before his eyes, right in front of Gawain. Klang's lifeless body crashed onto the sand. For a brief moment, everything seemed to freeze. Sion stood there calmly, his eyes fixed on the pirate captain as he said in a cold voice, "Now it's your turn." However, before he could do anything else, Gawain had already moved. The D-rank pirate captain appeared behind Sion in an instant and launched a devastating attack intended to finish him off in a single blow. Yet the moment his strike landed, something felt wrong. Gawain quickly realized that Sion was no longer standing where he had aimed. Looking toward another position, he narrowed his eyes in confusion. "Did he dodge my attack?" he muttered. But after a closer look, he came to a different conclusion. Sion had not simply evaded. Somehow he had perfectly blocked the attack. Sion kept his focus on one of the remaining pirates, carefully tracking every movement. At that exact moment, another pirate rushed toward him from behind, hoping to catch him off guard. Unfortunately for them, Sion had already anticipated it. The sand beneath his feet suddenly stirred, and dozens of sharp sand spears erupted from the ground like deadly fangs. While Sion was occupied dealing with that attacker, Gawain saw an opportunity and charged from behind once again. As he closed the distance, frustration and confusion filled his mind. "What kind of trick is this brat using?" he thought. Gathering all of his strength into a single punch, he unleashed a full-powered strike directly at Sion. Yet before the blow could reach its target, a wall of sand surged upward and blocked it completely. Gawain's eyes widened. "What the hell is this?" he shouted. His anger exploded. "You've been playing cheap tricks this whole time. You think this little bit of sand can stop me?" Roaring with fury, he threw another punch and shattered the sand shield into countless fragments. However, what he saw beyond the broken barrier shocked him even more. Another one of his subordinates had already been killed. Staring at the fallen pirate, Gawain yelled, "Masimoto!" His expression darkened as realization struck him. "This guy looks like he's controlling something. Pincher attack!" But it was already too late. Sion pulled his sword free from the pirate's body and slowly turned his gaze toward Gawain. His eyes glowed with an intense light, making it obvious that he was no longer calm. Pure anger burned within him. As Sion stared at the pirate captain, Pavilsa's earlier words echoed through his mind. "You're probably more worried about killing a human than you are about fighting a D-rank." Then her voice became even firmer. "But keep this in mind. Those bastards aren't human." Sion had been confused when he first heard that. "They're not?" he had asked. Pavilsa's answer came immediately. "That's right. They enjoy killing people. They torture and slaughter others for absolutely no reason. They take pride in violating women and butchering children. More than 200 people have died at their hands. Do you really think creatures like that are human?" Those words now rang clearly in Sion's ears. After throwing the dead pirate's body aside, he glared at Gawain with burning hatred. At the same time, Gawain rushed forward with all of his strength, veins bulging across his body as murderous intent exploded from him. "Son of a bitch!" he roared. In response, Sion sent countless sharp projectiles flying toward him. The sand transformed into deadly spikes that shot through the air like arrows. Yet Gawain continued charging straight through them while shouting, "Still running your mouth? You think this crap is enough to beat me? You piece of trash, I'm not gonna let you die peacefully. I'll slice you up bit by bit and feed you to the magic beasts. I'll make you listen to your family's screams while you're being eaten alive. I'll make you beg for death." Despite the terrifying threats, Sion's expression remained cold. He looked directly into Gawain's eyes and calmly asked, "Are those your last words?" Hearing that only made the pirate captain even angrier. His face twisted with rage as he charged forward. Meanwhile, Sion's masters watched from afar, and unlike Gawain, they looked surprisingly pleased. They could see the change happening within their student. Sion slowly tightened his grip around his sword and stared at the pirate captain with absolute contempt. "Piece of trash." The insult struck Gawain harder than any weapon. His eyes widened in disbelief before his rage reached an entirely new level. "Calling us trash?" he bellowed furiously as he prepared to throw himself at Sion with everything he had left. As Captain Gawain looked at the lifeless bodies of his fallen comrades, scattered across the battlefield, his expression darkened. Staring at them in disbelief, he muttered, "Clang, Masimoto." They were both men I acknowledged. They'd never be taken down by some amateur. Just what kind of power? Is this kid using? The deaths of his companions had shaken him, but rather than fear, they only fueled his anger. Releasing a powerful surge of aura from his body, Gawain fixed his eyes on Sion and shouted, "I'm not playing along with your tricks anymore. Why don't you show your true power hidden in the sand? If you're a real awakener, stop hiding and face me." In reality, Gawain was deliberately trying to provoke Sion, hoping to draw him out and force him into a direct confrontation. As Sion rushed toward him at tremendous speed, countless sand projectiles shot through the air from every direction. However, Gawain calmly blocked every single one of them with the aura surrounding his body. Standing firm, he glanced around the battlefield and said, "So what's your next move going to be?" He looked ahead, expecting to see Sion charging toward him, but there was no sign of him. His eyes widened slightly as he muttered, "Again?" He disappeared again. Where the hell is he now? At that exact moment, Sion suddenly appeared behind him and launched a surprise attack. Yet instead of landing a decisive blow, he was met with shock. Gawain had already raised his guard and blocked the attack perfectly. Inside his mind, Sion was stunned. How did he predict my attack? He wondered. A confident grin appeared on Gawain's face as he answered with his actions. "Finally," he said coldly, "you're within my attack range." With those words, the battle entered a completely different phase. The distance that Sion had relied on to stay safe had vanished, and now he was trapped in close combat against a warrior who specialized in it. During the fierce exchange, Gawain suddenly spoke while overwhelming Sion with relentless pressure. "You're not even a combat type, yet you close the distance like that. You have no idea, do you? A single mistake in battle will cost you your life." Before Sion could react, Gawain's hand shot forward and wrapped tightly around his throat. The captain's grip was like iron, crushing the air from Sion's lungs. Then the brutal assault began. Sion immediately realized that everything had been part of Gawain's plan from the start. He had intentionally provoked him, forcing him to abandon his advantages and step into the one place where Gawain held absolute superiority. "I'll make you feel every blow," Gawain growled as he pulled back his fist. "This one's for Masamoto." The punch crashed into Sion with terrifying force. A violent shockwave exploded outward, sending dust and debris flying across the battlefield. Before Sion could recover, Gawain raised another fist, his rage burning hotter than ever. "This is for Claying! For Alaya! For Ezreal! For Miraz!" Each name was followed by another devastating punch. One after another, his fist slammed into Sion's face with merciless force. The barrage seemed endless. Every strike carried the grief, fury, and frustration he felt over the deaths of his comrades. Blood flew through the air as Sion's condition rapidly worsened. His face became bruised and battered under the relentless assault, and his body shook with every impact. After delivering countless blows, Gawain continued to hold Sion in place and stared directly into his battered face. His voice was cold, heavy with both anger and confidence as he declared, "No matter what your ability is, Captain." Gawain tightened his grip around Sion's throat and looked down at him with complete confidence. "It's useless once I've got you in my grip," he said coldly. "Blame your own weakness or die." With those merciless words, he drew back his fist, preparing to deliver the final blow that would end the battle once and for all. However, as he tried to drive his punch forward, something felt wrong. His fist refused to move the way he expected. A look of confusion appeared on his face as he muttered, "What?" For a brief moment, he could not understand what had happened. "I know I was holding him," he thought. Instinctively, he turned around to look behind him, and what he saw immediately made his eyes widen. Several portals had opened behind him. He took off the gauntlets. "To escape!" The realization hit him instantly. Sion had somehow abandoned the gauntlets and slipped free from his grasp. Before Gawain could fully process what had happened, an extremely powerful attack crashed directly into him. The impact was tremendous, forcing the captain backward as the force of the blow tore through the battlefield. While Gawain was being pushed back, Sion stood off to the side, silently watching everything unfold. After receiving the attack, Gawain quickly regained his composure and began analyzing the situation. A critical mistake, he thought. "I panicked and let him go, but this wound, the power behind it has clearly dropped. His attacks have definitely lost momentum." His sharp eyes narrowed as he continued piecing everything together. Those gauntlets must have been amplifying his power. He must be a wind attribute user, a rare type among magic users. He's using sand to add physical force to his attacks. "I figured out all your tricks." Convinced that he had finally understood Sion's abilities, Gawain began gathering immense power into his fist once again. Aura surged around him as he charged forward, intending to finish the battle before Sion could create another opportunity. "Now that you've lost your gauntlets, you're not nearly as powerful," Gawain shouted. "A magic type without an amplifier? You think you can beat a combat type at close range?" Sion simply stared at him without saying a word. Then, in the next instant, everything changed. A massive sand spike suddenly erupted from behind Gawain. It pierced straight through his body before he could react. The attack was so sudden and unexpected that even someone of his caliber failed to avoid it. "He aimed for my back!" Gawain realized in shock. Not far away, Sion slowly smiled despite the blood covering his bruised and battered face. Looking exhausted but satisfied, he muttered, "That damn old man, finally!" He lowered his guard. The truth became clear at once. From the very beginning, Sion had been waiting for this exact moment. He had allowed Gawain to believe that he had figured everything out. He had let him become overconfident. And the instant Gawain lowered his guard, Sion struck with lethal precision. "You son of a bitch!" Gawain roared in fury. "Using the same trick on me?" But his anger quickly turned into disbelief. His eyes widened as he looked at the attack that had pierced him and then back at Sion. "He doesn't have the gauntlets," he thought in shock. The more he considered it, the less sense it made. It's impossible for a magic type to channel this much power through sand without an item amplifying their ability. It's just not possible. For the first time since the battle had begun, uncertainty crept into Captain Gawain's mind. Everything he thought he had figured out was collapsing before his eyes. The assumptions he had built his strategy around were wrong, and Sion's true capabilities were proving to be far beyond anything he had imagined. As blood dripped from the devastating wound in his body, Gawain finally realized that the young man standing before him was far more dangerous than he had ever believed. The sand spike was still piercing straight through Captain Gawain's body, yet even as blood flowed from the wound, he seemed unable to accept what he was witnessing. His eyes remained fixed on Sion, filled with disbelief and confusion. The pieces were beginning to come together in his mind, but the conclusion was so unbelievable that he struggled to say it aloud. "This kid," he muttered. A chill ran down his spine as a terrifying possibility crossed his mind. "Don't tell me he's—" His voice trailed off. Beneath his feet, the ground itself was beginning to disappear and shift under Sion's control. The battlefield no longer felt like ordinary terrain. It felt as though the very world around them was obeying Sion's will. "That kind of ability," Gawain whispered. "An ability that controls sand, that manipulates the world itself. It shouldn't exist." The realization shook him to his core. What he had originally dismissed as a collection of tricks and unusual techniques was proving to be something far more terrifying. Every grain of sand around them had become an extension of Sion's power. There was no clear boundary between the battlefield and the weapon he wielded. Watching the scene unfold, Pavilsa was equally stunned. His eyes never left Sion as he tried to comprehend what he was seeing. "He can control sand," Pavilsa said quietly. "The entire world is his weapon and shield. I can't believe what I'm seeing." For a moment, he fell silent, carefully analyzing everything that had happened throughout the battle. "Besides," he continued, "Gawain is a scavenger with immense combat experience. If they had fought head-on, Sion's life would have been in real danger." The more he thought about it, the more unbelievable Sion's actions became. This kid used his status as an irregular to lure his opponent into letting his guard down. He made Gawain believe he was inexperienced. He made him think he had already figured out all of his abilities. Pavilsa's expression grew increasingly serious. He waited for the perfect opening. The experience needed to make those decisions. He acquired it all through instinct. That was the most shocking part. Normally, such judgment could only be developed after countless battles, years of training and surviving life and death situations. Yet Sion had displayed that level of tactical awareness naturally, as if it were second nature. Absurd as it sounds, Pavilsa said slowly, "He did it in the middle of a fight." His gaze remained locked on Sion, who stood battered and bloodied but completely unbroken. "He's no mere tiger cub, that's for sure." Those words carried genuine respect. A tiger cub was dangerous because it would eventually become a monster. But what Pavilsa was witnessing was something else entirely. Sion was already evolving in real time, adapting and growing stronger, with every passing moment of battle. Unable to contain his amazement any longer, Pavilsa suddenly turned toward Crayon and demanded an answer. "Where the hell did you find a hellish monster like that?" His voice echoed across the battlefield as everyone, after the battle, finally came to an end. The scene shifted to Sion. His condition was far from good. His face was swollen and covered in blood, his body was bruised from head to toe, and every movement caused pain to shoot through his muscles. Even so, a faint smile appeared on his face as he looked back on the fight. "That was a close one," he muttered while catching his breath. "It could have been really dangerous." The memory of Gawain's devastating punches was still fresh in his mind. He knew better than anyone how close he had come to losing. If one of his hits had landed wrong, I'd have been done for. As he spoke, he wiped the blood from his face and let out a small laugh. "But the old man will praise me for a fight that good, right?" Despite everything he had endured, Sion seemed oddly satisfied with the outcome. However, before he could relax any further, something happened that immediately caught his attention. A new path had opened. The entire area seemed to shift as a previously hidden route revealed itself before everyone present. Sion stared at it in surprise, but before he could say anything, a furious voice echoed through the area. "You damn halfwit! How dare you try to come back after that fight?" It was Crayon. The old warrior's face was filled with anger as he glared directly at Sion. Sion blinked in confusion. Wait, Crayon! At least tell me the reason. What did I do wrong this time? He genuinely seemed unable to understand why Crayon was so furious. But that only made Crayon even angrier. The guy you spared, Crayon shouted. How could you not notice? He was trying to stab you! You couldn't even predict that? The accusation left Sion completely stunned. He had not expected that to be the reason. Crayon continued without giving him a chance to respond. How long are you going to keep that complacent attitude? His voice was sharp and merciless. As he spoke, Crayon stepped down with his sword in hand, his expression showing both frustration and disappointment. Go back. That attitude will get you killed soon. The words were harsh, but they carried genuine concern beneath them. Nearby, Pavilsa and Kaylee watched the entire exchange in silence. Neither of them interrupted. They simply observed as Crayon lectured Sion. It's not too late yet, Crayon continued. Go back. At this point, he looked completely disappointed. It was obvious that he believed Sion's kindness and willingness to spare enemies would eventually become a fatal weakness. An awkward silence filled the area. Then suddenly a voice came from the front. Thanks. Everyone turned toward the source of the voice. Pavilsa and Kaylee had stepped down and approached them. As they arrived, they spoke calmly. All Archelon residents are non-combatants. There was no shame in their voices, only honesty. Those of us in the Mott clan just aren't cut out for fighting. Their words carried a strange sense of humility. While Sion and the others had risked their lives in brutal combat, the people of Archelon were fundamentally different. They were not warriors, soldiers, or fighters. They were ordinary residents who had survived by relying on others and supporting one another. As the tension slowly settled after the battle, the contrast became clear. While Crayon worried that Sion's compassion would one day get him killed, Pavilsa and Kaylee seemed grateful that someone like him existed at all. In a world filled with endless conflict and bloodshed, Sion still possessed the ability to show mercy, even if that mercy sometimes infuriated the veterans around him. The newly opened path stood before them, signaling that the journey was not yet over, while the conversation around Sion revealed an equally important truth. Although he was growing stronger with every battle, there were still many lessons he had yet to learn. Pavilsa stepped forward and spoke with complete sincerity. We're all blacksmiths. All we can do is swing our tools at scavengers. Without you, I can't even imagine how many people would be dead by now. Truly, thank you. You did really well. Before Sion could respond, Kaylee rushed toward him and wrapped him in a tight hug. Yeah, you were so cool. You fought the entire black shark all by yourself. Don't stress about what that monster Crayon said. He's always had ridiculously high standards. When I first forged a dagger as a child. But before she could finish, Sion quietly interrupted. No, I knew Mashimoto could attack me when I spared his life. But I didn't kill him. His voice was calm, yet heavy with self-blame. I tried so hard not to see that truth. I just wanted Mashimoto to pass out and disappear. I knew they were all evil. I knew they deserved to be killed. But I didn't have the courage to be the one who ended it. All because of a cowardly reason. I didn't want to feel the guilt of killing someone. The atmosphere immediately grew silent. Crayon is right, Sion continued. He must have seen countless people like me get killed before. So he's probably being considerate in his own way, hoping I don't die the same way. Hearing those words, Diordan let out a quiet sigh before speaking. Crayon is just clumsy when it comes to expressing himself. The explanation was simple, but it carried a certain truth. Crayon's harsh words had sounded cruel, yet perhaps they had come from experience rather than malice. After hearing Sion's confession, neither Pavilsa nor Kaylee could find anything to say. The two simply stood there in silence. They had been ready to comfort him, to praise him for saving everyone, but now they could see the burden he was carrying. While they viewed him as a hero, who had protected the village against impossible odds, Sion himself could only think about the life he had failed to take and the consequences that followed. The gratitude, admiration, and praise surrounding him could not erase the guilt and hesitation he felt within his own heart. For a moment, no one spoke. The air became heavy with unspoken thoughts. Pavilsa lowered his gaze while Kaylee slowly loosened her embrace. Neither of them knew how to answer Sion's honesty. They understood that this was not a wound that could be healed with simple words of encouragement. And so the three remained there quietly, surrounded by silence, while Sion reflected on his weakness and the harsh truth behind Crayon's criticism. Even though everyone else saw him as the hero who had saved countless lives that day, Sion could only see the hesitation that had nearly cost even more lives in return. Kaylee immediately stepped back and moved behind Pavilsa, staring at Sion, as if she had just witnessed something unbelievable. I've never heard someone say that about Crayon. Did he hit his head or something? Her reaction was so genuine that, under normal circumstances, it might have made everyone laugh. But Pavilsa wasn't paying attention to her joke. Instead, he was quietly processing everything Sion had said. He was hesitating in a fight where his life was on the line. It must have been hard for him. Pavilsa lowered his eyes as guilt settled heavily in his chest. Especially at his age, it's a lot to comprehend. I feel relieved and guilty at the same time. Poor kids going through all this because of us useless adults. The realization left a bitter taste in his mouth. While they had all been grateful for Sion's strength, they had forgotten how young he truly was. The burden he was carrying was far too heavy for someone his age. Pushing those thoughts aside for the moment, Pavilsa clapped his hands together and spoke loudly to lighten the mood. "All right, let's go inside and eat." Then he looked directly at Sion. "Kid, you should go wash up first." Everyone agreed and responded with a quick "okay" before heading inside. A little later, they made their way upstairs. Meanwhile, Crayon was sitting alone in a room, quietly minding his own business. The old man appeared completely relaxed, as though nothing important had happened that day. Suddenly, the door burst open. Sion rushed inside and immediately shouted, "Why are you pretending not to be there?" Crayon slowly turned his head toward him and smirked. "Well, if it isn't our little scaredy cat." The teasing grin on his face widened. "Did you come so you can go home?" Sion frowned instantly. "What's with that tone?" Then he crossed his arms and tried to sound confident. "Gramps, you're underestimating me. Let me make it clear, I don't break that easily." That was no big deal, however. Before he could continue acting tough, Crayon calmly interrupted him. "Your hands are still trembling." Sion froze. Only. Then did he notice the slight shaking in his fingers. Crayon's expression softened, becoming far more serious than before. "It's normal." His voice no longer carried any mockery. "You'd be crazy if you were okay." The room fell silent as he continued. "It's not easy killing someone," Crayon spoke, from experience, each word carrying an undeniable weight. "You're ending a life." After all, his gaze remained fixed on Sion, "and that guilt follows you forever." Sion quietly listened, unable to argue. There was no ridicule in Crayon's voice now, no insults, no harsh criticism, just a blunt truth spoken by someone who had lived through it himself, so there's no need to forget it, Crayon said calmly. "And there's no need to numb yourself to it either." The old man leaned back in his seat, his eyes carrying a rare seriousness. "The guilt should stay with you. Remembering it means you still understand the value of a life. The day you stop feeling anything after taking someone's life is the day you become far more dangerous than the people you fight." For the first time since entering the room, Sion found himself speechless. Crayon's earlier words had sounded cruel and heartless, but now Sion finally began to understand. The old man had never been mocking his weakness. He had been warning him. Crayon knew exactly how heavy the act of killing could become, and he didn't want Sion to lose himself trying to escape that burden. The room grew quiet once more as the old warrior and the young fighter sat facing each other, the tension slowly fading. Beneath Crayon's rough attitude and sharp tongue was a concern that he simply didn't know how to express properly, and perhaps, for the first time, Sion was beginning to see it. Crayon continued speaking in the same calm but firm tone. "Feeling no guilt would make you no better than the men you killed. Remember this, if this torments you, that's proof you're still human. If it's too hard to bear, you can return now." The old man offered him a way out, but Sion immediately shook his head. "I told you already, I won't break." His voice was filled with determination. "That's no problem for me. I'll guard my own life. So don't worry." Then a grin appeared on his face as he added, "Besides, how could I leave a stubborn old man like you all alone? I'll stick with you so you don't die of loneliness." For a brief moment, Crayon actually smiled. Seeing that rare reaction, Sion pressed on with a smug expression. "Still, having me here is less lonely, no?" The old man remained silent. "Be honest with yourself." Sion folded his arms confidently. "Shh. Without me, who else is going to clean up your corpse?" The instant those words left his mouth, Crayon's fist shot forward. "Wait, use words, not fists!" Sion's panicked shout echoed through the room as the old man immediately resorted to his preferred method of communication, despite the serious conversation they had just shared. Deep within the forge, an extraordinary sight unfolded. Numerous master blacksmiths had gathered together in one place, all focused on a single task. The air trembled with heat and spiritual energy as they worked tirelessly, pouring their skill and concentration into the process. Kaylee stared at the scene with wide eyes. "My God, I've never seen master smiths gathered like this before." The sight was almost unbelievable. Standing beside her, Pavilsa nodded as though it was only natural. It's to be expected. They're tempering the spirit of Dejordan's sword, after all. Even so, Kaylee couldn't hide her disbelief. "But it's already been days." She looked toward the sword again. "How can a sword exude this much power?" One of the smiths nearby let out a slow breath before answering. "This sword, Crayon, is a masterpiece. A weapon forged from one man's obsession." His eyes remained fixed on the blade. "That's all I can say." Yet that explanation only made Kaylee more curious. "But I've never seen anything like this." She continued staring at the sword in amazement. "I can't believe a human made this either. It has countless enchantments, hundreds of thousands of cores, and the souls of beasts embedded within it." A chill ran down her spine. "Honestly, it feels more like a living thing than a sword." The blade seemed to possess a presence of its own, almost as if it were breathing. "Who on earth made that?" Kaylee whispered the question without taking her eyes off the weapon. Were they even human? Her grandfather finally answered. Crayon. Kaylee blinked. Wait, so the swordsmith and the sword share the same name? Pavilza nodded. That's how great of a work it is. The fact that both the creator and the sword carried the same name only emphasized the legendary status of the weapon. It was no longer merely a sword. It had become a symbol of its creator's life's work and obsession. Eventually, Pavilza turned away. We can talk about it later. The group headed toward a room nearby. As soon as they entered, however, they froze. The scene before them was so unexpected that everyone stared in shock. Crayon doesn't stay in one place for very long, Pavilza muttered. So they're probably ready to leave. Then Kaylee looked ahead and immediately shouted, What's this bullshit now, Crayon? Her voice was filled with disbelief. Standing in the room was Crayon, looking completely unconcerned. Disciplining him. He answered as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. Kay tries to pull Sion, who's been planted headfirst into the floor, free. Pavilza immediately scolds Crayon for treating the young man so harshly. Diode, ever the tough master, retorts that Sion shouldn't have sassed an old man. Sighing at their antics, Pavilza gets down to business, informing Crayon that the work on his legendary sword, Crayon, is almost finished, meaning they'll be able to leave soon. Crayon is genuinely surprised, exclaiming that the work was completed much faster than he expected. He heartily praises the unparalleled skill of Archelon's blacksmiths. Pavilza simply tells him to stop by the workshop to pick it up. But as Diodon thanks him, Pavilza's face freezes, his eyes widening in shock and realization. Pavilza turns and asks Diodon to repeat what he just said about their parting. Diodon stands his ground, reminding Pavila of his own words from their last meeting, that they would probably never see each other again. With his back turned, Crayon's voice is heavy with resignation. He agrees, stating that he truly doesn't believe they will ever meet again in this lifetime. The finality in his tone hits Pavila hard. This is truly goodbye. A painful memory surfaces. Pavilza recalls a dark day when everyone, himself included, chose to turn their backs on a difficult truth, choosing to live as cowards running away. He remembers the weight of that decision, how the life they were given became a burden too heavy to bear. As a witness to that day, he knows this better than anyone. But among the cowards, there was one exception. Diodon was the only one who never looked back, the only one who walked forward into the light alone. He alone shouldered the burden of over a century. How could Pavila not feel complete and utter awe for a man like that? Crayon once again gives his old friend a heartfelt thanks for everything he has done. In a sudden shift, Crayon breaks the heavy atmosphere with a booming laugh and a wave, cheerfully saying he'll see him next time. The words next time echo in Pavilza's mind. He looks up, a glimmer of hope and confusion in his eyes. That's when he spots him. Peeking out from behind a Odin is Sion, flashing a triumphant, mischievous grin. Pavila finally understands Sion's promise to stick around and make sure the old geyser doesn't die alone wasn't just empty talk. With a renewed spirit, Pavila calls out to the departing pair joyfully, telling them he'll look forward to seeing them again. 2 weeks later, Pavila sits alone on a rock in the vast desert. He muses to himself that the past 2 weeks have flown by in the blink of an eye. His quiet contemplation is interrupted by a playful sneak attack from Kay, who pops up behind him with a little roar. He chides her for acting like a child, but she just pouts, insisting that she's still young. But Vilsa notices her mood, observing that she's acting particularly childish today. He gently asks if something is bothering her. Kay looks off into the distance, admitting that she just feels a little empty inside now that Sion is gone. She explains that after being so worried about him, she can't stop replaying the memory of his pure, unadulterated joy when they gave him his new gear. A flashback shows Sion's wide-eyed amazement as he learned his new breastplate was made from the wolf ant queen that nearly killed him. He was completely floored by the sheer amount of enchanted items they gifted him. His face a picture of disbelief. His excitement peaked when he discovered the subspace storage, marveling at its capacity and cheekily asking Deodaden if he wanted to get inside. Seeing him laugh with such pure childish delight reminded Kay that despite his immense power, Sion was still just a kid at heart. She smiles wistfully, hoping he can keep that bright smile of his. She then laughs, realizing she sounds just like her grandfather. Pavila teases that she's about 50 years too early for that, but his expression turns serious as he makes a request of his granddaughter. He asks Kay that if their paths ever cross with Xeons again, she must promise to help him. Kay beams, enthusiastically agreeing. She declares that Sion saved Archelon, making him an honorary member of their clan. She vows to create her greatest masterpiece for him. Pavila looks down, his expression resolute and filled with a deep sense of duty. He firmly believes they will meet Sion again. By helping the young man who inherited Diodon's will, they can begin to repay their immense debt. A debt, he reveals, that is owed to Diodon, not just by them, but by all of humanity. Meanwhile, Sion's training in the desert continues, punctuated by a swift fist to the head from his master. Reeling from the blow, Sion yelps in pain, demanding to know why the old man hit him. He complains that his IQ is already low enough without Crayon, trying to lower it further. The master's excuse. Sion was making too much noise while he was trying to sleep. Sion protests, pointing out that Dodden was the one who ordered him to kill any magic beast he saw at night. He gets so worked up. He claims even Crayon's great sword, Crayon, is clicking its tongue in disapproval at his master's ridiculousness. Crayon's solution to Sion's low IQ is simple. Hit him on the other side of the head to balance it out. Now half buried in the sand with 2 steaming lumps on his head, a defeated Sion mutters, "That's not how it works." He turns to his friend, the sword Creon, and complains that it didn't take his side in the argument. Diadon tells him to cut the crap, but Sion looks surprisingly pleased. Through all the chaos, he succeeded in his goal, completely exhausting his mana for the day. He's taking his master's training to heart. Mana is like a muscle. You have to push it to its absolute limit to make it grow. He's determined to maximize his capacity and improve his skills. The driving force behind this intense new resolve is the memory of his fight against the scavenger. It was his first real battle against another awakened human, not a monster, and he's honest with himself. He lost. He hesitated when facing a person, a weakness he can't afford. After Crayon left him in the desert, the overwhelming emotion that consumed him wasn't despair, but pure unadulterated anger at his own weakness and complacency. He realized that a single moment of carelessness could invalidate his entire struggle for survival. Even the low-level monsters he fought had more will to live than he showed in that moment. Looking up at the desert sky, he felt the cold sting of disappointment. It was an awful feeling he vowed to never experience again. He has to get stronger no matter what it takes. He knows his limits, but he also sees his potential. So for now, he'll focus on his training and mastering the new gauntlet that Kay gifted him. He remembers her instructions. Inserting a fire attribute item will enhance its power. He regrets not grabbing a core from the Drake dungeon and wonders if being able to communicate with his weapon is the secret to his master's strength. As he continues his training, he mutters to himself, questioning if the old man's crankiness is a sign of male menopause. Suddenly, Crayon's voice cuts in, asking if he's finished harvesting. Sion, cleaning a magic crystal, confirms that he is. Crayon stands observing the setting sun. It's time to move on. He casually asks if the sun is setting faster than usual, or if it's just an illusion caused by their constant activity. Crayon explains that the change in the sun's movement means they've crossed over into a new, unfamiliar region of the vast desert. With no landmarks, they must rely on the sun to navigate. Sion cheekily interprets this as his master finally letting him find a place to sleep. Crayon denies it, but his attention is quickly drawn to something on the horizon. It seems they've got a welcoming party. From their vantage point on a dune, they spot a massive dark shape looming in the distance. Sion squints, trying to make it out. He wonders if it's a mine or just a strange rock formation, noting it seems too small for a mine. A wide, manic grin spreads across Daoden's face. He tells the boy that this is just the tip of the iceberg. And what lies beneath the sand is truly surprising. With a roar, he declares that an unimaginably massive mountain is buried beneath them. A rock so colossal that even the monstrous sandworms dare not approach it. Sion is just left bewildered by his master's sudden explosion of excitement, shouting, "Just like you!" Crayon takes a running leap, soaring through the air towards the towering rock. Sion watches him go with a weary sigh, chalking it up to his master's excitement about reaching a new region. He mutters under his breath that taking care of the elderly is a tough job. Sion follows his master, sand surfing, easily scaling the sheer rock face. He arrives at the top to find Daoden already lounging comfortably, who casually asks what took him so long. Sion gives him a deadpan look and asks if they've somehow swapped mental ages. He then pulls out 2 pieces of dried meat. The master and apprentice sit down, kick up their feet, and tosses the jerky in their mouth in unison. A rare moment of peace in the harsh desert. Dyson finally breaks the silence, asking Sion how he's faring in the desert. Sion replies that he's managing well,
thanks to his master's teachings,
but admits he still has a long way to go. Daoden grunts that at least the boy knows his place, with a smirk. Sion adds that it's hard to feel strong when traveling with a monster like him. Daoden just dismisses it as useless flattery. The light-hearted mood fades as Sion's expression turns serious. He has an important question for his master. He asks how far he is from mastering the sand ability Crayon said he would need. His master looks to the swirling, star-filled night sky and gives him a benchmark. When he can split a sandstorm that covers the heavens, he'll be ready. Sion looks down, the sheer scale of the task weighing on him for a moment. Crayon offers him a new path. He tells Sion that if he continues on their current route, he will eventually find a dungeon that Crayon himself discovered decades ago for personal reasons. He warns that it is an extremely dangerous place, but he adds, conquering it might be the key to rapidly improving Sion's skills. He poses the question, will he go? Sion's face splits into a wide, almost feral grin, his eyes gleaming with excitement. He jumps to his feet, vibrating with energy, shouting to go right now. What are they waiting for? Theoden coolly tells him to just go to sleep. At that moment, panicked screams echo from below as a group frantically scramble up the rock face. They hear rustling in the darkness below. Sion instinctively asks if it's a magic beast. He senses one nearby and offers to take it out. But Crayon sarcastically asks if he'd rather try to make friends with it. The group are in a panic, trying to find a place to hide from whatever is chasing them. Quickly, deciding that splitting up would be even more dangerous. Sion and Crayon watch from above as the desperate group runs towards their location, assuming they're being pursued by a monster. But as they draw closer, Sion's eyes widen in surprise. It's a group of elves. The elves spot the two humans high above them on the rock pillar. Sion, seeing them for the first time, is amazed by their appearance. But his wonder quickly turns to disbelief when he hears their plan. One of the elves suggests throwing the humans to the monster, chasing them to create a distraction. Sion is appalled. He'd always heard elves were a noble race, but these ones are suggesting sacrificing them as bait. He thinks to himself that even the half-elf K is far better than them. Before he can process their cruelty, the elves have already scaled the rock face and stand before them. The lead elf wastes no time. She shouts at the humans, ordering them to get down from the rock. Her intention is clear. She wants them to go down and lure the magic beast away so they can escape. The entire group takes a hostile stance, weapons drawn, ready to force them into becoming monster food. Sion tries to reason with them, pointing out that they're clearly fast enough to escape on their own. Why do they need to sacrifice them? But his words fall on deaf ears. Suddenly, a wave of immense crushing pressure washes over the area, stunning everyone. At first, Sion thinks an unprecedented magic beast has appeared. The elves seem to feel the same crushing pressure, their faces frozen in terror. But he quickly realizes this feeling isn't coming from some approaching monster. It's a primal survival instinct triggered by pure, unadulterated fear. It's a terror unlike anything he's ever felt, even after facing countless magic beasts and awakened humans. Instinctively, he tries to find the source of this overwhelming aura. His eyes widen in horror as he realizes where it's coming from. The source of this soul-crushing pressure was none other than his own master, Crayon. The old man's killing intent is so potent it's almost a physical force, suffocating everything around him. The elves are completely paralyzed, their bravado shattered. The leader stammers, unable to comprehend how a mere human could possess such power. How could something like this even exist? She tries to steel herself, shouting at her comrades to get a grip. He's just a human. But her words are useless. Her companions are already on their knees. Completely broken by the old man's aura, she can't believe they're kneeling before a human. Overcome by a mixture of fear and pride, she makes a fatal decision. She declares she has to kill him. Gathering her power, she releases a magical arrow. Convinced that a human like this shouldn't exist, Sion screams, watching the deadly projectile fly towards his master. Completely terrified. But Duden doesn't even flinch. He just stands there unmoving. With a flick of his wrist, he effortlessly catches the supercharged arrow right before it can pierce his neck. He turns, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. The leader, horrified, tries to rally her group, telling them to get into a fighting stance. She screams that they just need to kill the human, and then everything will be fine. Suddenly, a voice cuts through the chaos, asking a chilling question. How did you survive? Before anyone can react, one of the male elves, Jorah, is struck down. Crayon appears in front of him in an instant, holding the elf by the head. Crayon snarls that he should have killed them all decades ago. His comrades scream at him to let Jorah go. Enraged that a mere human would dare lay hands on an elf, Diadon's grip tightens. He asks his question once more, his voice low and deadly. How did you bastards manage to survive? He roars, demanding to know who did they kill to survive this time. The question implies a dark past between him and this group. He applies more pressure, and with a sickening crunch, Jorah's head bursts like a tomato. The remaining elves look on with fear. In a flash, Crayon stomps down, sending a shockwave that knocks the elves off their feet. He recalls their twisted logic. It doesn't matter how many humans die for our sake, because human lives are worth less than bugs. Humans deserve to die, not elves. Diadon's fury explodes. He screams that because of bastards like them, even after seeing what the world has become, they still haven't changed a bit. Sion, caught in the chaos, is completely floored. What is he talking about? His master's words echo in his mind. The world becoming like this is all because of the non-human race. Just then, the ground erupts. The magic beast the elves were fleeing from finally reveals itself. A colossal subterranean monster. The elves scream in terror as they fall towards the massive creature, which they call a sulcurus. The elves seize the perfect opportunity, asking her companion to pit the beast against the humans. One screams at her companion Ikora to throw the smaller human, Sion, to the beast first. While the beast is distracted, she plans to corner the human who killed Jorah. But as she turns, her eyes widen in shock. The world seems to split in half. Crayon, a blur of motion, has already moved, splitting the monster and her in one strike. He doesn't stop, dispatching two more elves in an instant as they fall towards the beast. He lands gracefully, catching the one of the elves by her face. With chilling calm, he asks her again, "Your village is nearby, isn't it?" He offers a deal. He'll let her go if she answers him, but she responded in curses, so he slammed her hard on the ground. Her lifeless body now lies in the crater with overflowing red juice. The old warrior silhouette is the stuff of nightmares. Last of the elf is now a trembling mess, begging him not to come any closer. Sion, finally snapping out of his shock, rushes over, pleading with his master to stop. But Crayon just shoves him back with a wave of hand. The attack sends Sion flying, slamming him into the ground. He turns back to the cowering elf, mocking her for trembling before a human. With a wide, maniacal grin, he simply asks her one last time, "Tell me where your village is." She can't believe a human could know about an elf village. The sheer terror of what he might do completely breaks her. But one glance at this man's eyes made her forget about the well-being of her race. The eyes turned, pointing toward the village's direction. Zahn smiles, having gotten the information he wanted. She immediately starts begging for her life. Pleading that she was wrong and she's sorry, Diadon launches himself in the direction of the village, creating dust in its path. When the dust settles, the elf finds herself alone. A wave of relief washes over her, and she breaks into a hysterical laugh. She survived, but her relief is short-lived as she collapses. Her fate uncertain. Nearby, Sion pulls himself out of the rubble, bleeding and battered. He mutters about the crazy old man, realizing that if it weren't for his new breastplate, he'd have at least 4 broken ribs. He looks up, his body aching, and calls out to his master. He sees the devastation, the bodies, and the sheer power his master just unleashed. Why did he have to go this far? Sion, refusing to be left behind, scrambles to his feet and shouts after him, asking where on earth he's going. He remembers Crayon's chilling parting words to Jorah. "I should have killed you all decades ago. Where were you hiding?" His master's furious question about the non-human races being responsible for the state of the world now carries a terrifying new weight.
He arrives at his destination,
Calling out for his Gramps, only to be met with a horrifying sight. The elven village is ablaze, a scene of utter devastation that leaves him speechless. Before him lies a massacre, the ground littered with the lifeless bodies of elves. Panting heavily, Sion realizes that despite rushing here as fast as he could, he was too late. Kneeling amidst the carnage, he's overcome with despair. But then, through the crackling flames and his own sobs, he hears something. A voice. Someone is still alive. Hope surges through him. He leaps to his feet, sensing a survivor hidden nearby. Pushing his senses to the limit, he pinpoints their location. They're close. He cautiously approaches an alleyway, hearing faint cries for help. But his hope turns to horror as he sees the reflection in a survivor's eye. His own master ready to deliver the final blow. Crayon swings his massive blade without a shred of hesitation. Sion can't believe it. Is this merciless executioner really the Gramps who raised him? Sion unleashes his power, creating a sand titan. Anger. The two clash, a battle of ideals as Sion screams, questioning why his master has to take it this far. Crayon looking down at his apprentice with disdain. Questioning his attempt to play the hero, he unleashes a crushing force, a wave of power that slams into the boy. Sion is sent flying, completely powerless against his master's might. He tumbles helplessly through the air, the sheer force of the blow knocking the wind out of him. Crayon follows through with his attack, a brutal lesson in power. A cold, determined look is etched on the old man's face as he disciplines his student. Sion crashes into the ground with devastating impact. Shaking the very earth, he pushes himself from the dirt, groaning in frustration at the old man's methods. Deaden stands over him, scolding him for being not a hero, but a reckless wild cult. The old warrior reveals what he was thinking on his journey here. Sion admits he didn't interfere because he didn't understand his master's rage and felt it would be reckless. Crayon looks down unimpressed and coldly asks for Sion's point. Sion argues that while he could understand revenge, killing those who had already surrendered was going too far. In a flash, Crayon's boot is on Sion, grinding him into the dirt, telling him he uses the word understand far too easily. Crayon reminds him of his own past, asking if the scavengers he killed were the ones who killed his parents and interfere because he didn't understand his master and how he himself ran wild, using that as justification. Crayon explains that the elves' twisted way of thinking didn't just appear overnight. He lectures that those 4 were not unique. All non-humans are the same, killing either actively or passively. Still pinned to the ground, Sion's mind reels from these revelations. Crayon clarifies their motive. It wasn't for pleasure or religion. They killed solely for themselves, casting humans in the role of victims. He explains it was the only way they could avoid despairing over their own situation. Roaring with fury, Crayon tells him that Neo's soul's pity is an illusion. Here in the real world, it's a battlefield of pure struggle, and he must know where he stands before spouting nonsense about humanity. The old warrior reveals he has seen the world before and after its fall, a time Sion cannot comprehend. Slowly, Sion pushes himself up, his body aching, but his spirit unbroken. Crayon turns to leave, posing a final chilling question. Will Sion still hold his naive beliefs after he learns the truth of this world? Sion, bloody but defiant, demands to know what secret it is that he's missing. His master's answer is simple and terrifying. Everything tells him he is young and foolish, mistaking his reckless actions for justice because he knows nothing of their lives. But Sion counters, reminding the old man that it was he who taught him never to give up. With unwavering conviction in his eyes, he declares that he will forge his own path. He vows that even if he sees the same horrors his master has, even after learning the full truth, he will not give up on his ideals. The student and master stare each other down, a silent clash of will between two generations shaped by the same broken world. The old man relents, simply telling Sion to look around the village for his answers. Sion's eyes fall upon the clothes of a dead elf. He wonders where they could have gotten them. De Odin dismisses the question, saying they'll figure it out when they get back to Archelon. Left alone in the ruins, Sion begins his investigation. He notices the village's layout is strange. It's small with only houses but no shops, restaurants, or farms. It's not a self-sufficient settlement. A functional village needs more than just a place to sleep. Something about this place is fundamentally wrong. His search leads him to a large chest filled to the brim with trinkets and accessories. He examines the items. The craftsmanship is similar to things he's seen, but distinctly different. He's never seen this style before, not in any human city. The items don't feel like they were made by human hands. The texture feels ancient, as if they're from over 100 years ago. He remembers the official history. Non-human races only appeared 100 years ago when the world turned to desert. But could a race build a culture with such deep history in just a century? It seems impossible. He then finds a tablet covered in a swirling alien language he can't begin to decipher. He had always accepted the presence of non-humans and magic beasts as a fact of life as they were here long before he was born. But a chilling possibility takes root in his mind. What if they didn't just appear? What if they existed long before? Looking at the non-human artifacts, he realizes they likely didn't come to Earth by choice. A horrifying synthesis of these ideas begins to form. What if a powerful unknown being forcibly transported all these non-human races to Earth? If such a godlike entity exists, then the very foundation of his world is a lie. The final terrible piece of the puzzle clicks into place as he finds another chest, this one filled with the blood-stained possessions of humans. He finally understands. The village had no shops because they didn't need them. Everything they required, they stole by slaughtering humans. A mournful wind sweeps through the ghost town, carrying the silent screams of countless victims. Filled with a cold, solemn rage, Sion bursts. He stands amidst the carnage, sand swirling around his arms. He punches his fist into the ground, manipulating the sand. He carves a massive grave out of the unforgiving desert floor, swallowing the whole village. Kneeling before the rows of makeshift graves, he weeps for the fallen humans. He whispers that giving them this burial is the least respect he can pay.